Hey guys, tonight we are traveling back to a time when the long arm of the law was so long, it could reach right into the barnyard. We're going to a place where justice wasn't just blind, it was, frankly, a little nearsighted and possibly hallucinating. Imagine a world where a pig could be arrested, given a lawyer, and put on trial for murder. No, this isn't a bizarre fairy tale, it was a very real, very serious part of the legal system in medieval Europe. You're about to become a spectator in one of history's most surreal courtroom dramas, and a word of warning in this world. If you annoy the wrong farm animal, you might just find yourself testifying against it in court. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Your support truly means the world. Once you've done that, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop your city and the time in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how this little community spans the globe. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on the fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that hits you isn't the sight, but the smell. It's a damp, earthy scent, a mix of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the cold sweat of stone walls that haven't been dry in a century. You're standing at the back of a small, timber-beamed hall in a French village, somewhere in the 1400s. The light is weak, coming from a couple of high, narrow windows and a few sputtering tallow candles that do more to create shadows than to illuminate. This is not a grand cathedral of justice, it's a local secular court, the kind of place that handles land disputes and petty theft. But today, the air is thick with a gravity that feels altogether different. The room is packed. Peasants in rough spun tunics stand shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mixture of fear, morbid curiosity, and a kind of grim satisfaction. They murmur in low tones, their eyes fixed on the front of the room. There, a local magistrate, a man named Jean Levier, sits behind a heavy oak table. H.E.S. not a king's judge in fine robes, just a town elder with a heavy chain of office and an even heavier expression. Beside him, a clerk with an ink-stained nose shuffles parchments. A prosecutor, a thin man with a perpetually worried look, nervously thumbs through his notes. Everything seems normal and comfortably normal for a child. Then, the bailiff, a burly man with a leather jerkin and a loud voice, bangs his staff on the floor. All rise for the accused, he bellows, his voice echoing slightly in the cramped space. You shuffle your feet with the rest of the crowd. The heavy wooden door at the side of the hall creaks open. You expect to see a man in shackles, perhaps a notorious bandit or a sullen poacher. Instead, two guards emerge, pulling on a rope. And at the end of that rope is the defendant. It's a pig, a large, grimy sow, blinking in the dim light, her snout twitching as she takes in the 100 new smells of the courtroom. She lets out a confused snort. A few children in the crowd giggle, but are quickly silenced by a sharp shush from their parents. This is not a laughing matter. The pig is guided, with some difficulty, into a small wooden pen that has been set up where a defendant would normally stand. She bumps against the side, rattling the crude construction, and you realize you're witnessing the start of a formal legal proceeding. The mainstream historical knowledge here is that this really happened, from the 9th to the 19th century. There are dozens of documented cases, particularly in France, Switzerland, and Germany, where animals were put on trial for crimes, especially for injuring or killing humans. The clerk stands, unrolls a scroll, and begins to read in a loud, monotonous voice, first in Latin, the language of Lord God, and then in the local French dialect. The charge is read out with chilling formality. The defendant, a sow of common stock, owned by the farmer Jacques Pinchet, dead on the 3rd day of May, with malice and aforethought, willfully and wickedly attacked the infant child of Jean Martin, causing mortal wounds whereof the aforementioned child did perish. For this heinous sect, the defendant is charged with murder. You look from the pig, who is now attempting to chew on the corner of her own witness box. To the faces of the jury, a panel of stern-faced local men. They are deadly serious. This is where a strange, niche detail of these trials comes into play. While awaiting her day in court, this pig was not kept in a sty. She was held in the local jail, in a cell, at the town's expense. She was fed the same bread and water as any human prisoner awaiting trial, a fact that would be meticulously recorded in the court's financial ledgers. The cost of her incarceration was a public record. This raises the central, mind-boggling question: why go through this elaborate, expensive, and, to our eyes, utterly absurd process? This is a point where historians still don't have a single, unified answer. Some scholars argue that these trials were a form of communal catharsis. In a world without scientific explanations for tragedy, a child's death caused by an animal was a rupture in the natural, God-given order. A trial was a way to ritually restore that order, to show that human law and divine justice prevailed over the chaos of nature. Others suggest it was a literal interpretation of Scripture, citing passages from the Old Testament where an ox that gores a person must be stoned. But a more provocative theory is that this was about property and responsibility, a way to legally and publicly deal with a dangerous animal and, by extension, its owner. The academic community continues to debate whether this was about punishing the animal's sin, managing social anxiety, or simply a very literal application of legal theory. The magistrate, le vieillard, leans forward. Let the record show the defendant is present, he declares, his voice flat. The prosecutor stands up, ready to present his case against the sow. He has witnesses. He has evidence. And somewhere in the town, a defense attorney, appointed by the court, is preparing his argument. For now, you just stare at the pig, who has found a particularly interesting patch of mud on her leg and is intently focused on it. The weight of human law, justice, and theology rests on her bristly back, and she seems completely, blissfully unaware. The trial has just begun. The prosecutor clears his throat, and the rustling in the room subsides. You watch him, expecting a fiery speech, a dramatic condemnation. But what you get is something far more chilling: bureaucracy. He speaks in a dry, procedural tone, outlining the facts as if he were discussing a boundary dispute. He points a bony finger not at the pig, but at the court records on the clerk's table, as per the testimony of the child's mother, corroborated by 2 neighbors. He drones. The sow was found with blood upon its snout, standing over the cradle. The child, deceased, bore marks consistent with the teeth of such an animal. This is the first thing you need to understand to make sense of this scene. This isn't a kangaroo court or a case of mob justice. It's the opposite. It is a meticulous, almost obsessive, application of the law. You're witnessing the legal system of the time trying to categorize and process a horrific event using the only tools it has. In medieval legal theory, particularly under systems derived from Roman law, there was a concept known as NOx, null surrender. The idea was that if a person's property, be it a slave, a child, or an animal, caused harm, the owner was liable. However, the owner could escape that liability by surrendering the offending property to the injured party or to the state for punishment. These trials were, in one sense, the ultimate expression of that principle. The pig wasn't just a pig, it was a legal entity, the corpus delicti, the body of the crime itself. The prosecutor calls his first witness, a woman with a tear-streaked face and hollow eyes. The baby's mother is helped to the front. She speaks in a whisper, her words barely audible, recounting the moment she discovered the scene. The magistrate leans in to hear her. The clerk's quill scratches furiously, documenting every word. No one finds it strange that her testimony is being used against an animal. In the eyes of this court, the pig's guilt is a matter to be determined by evidence and due process, just like any other defendant. A second witness, a farmer who lives nearby, confirms he heard a scream and saw the sow running from the Martin family's cottage. His testimony is taken with equal solemnity. This is where you might notice a truly peculiar detail. A tidbit of history that feels like it's from a Monty Python sketch. These trials were expensive. The court had to pay for the animal's imprisonment, the jailer's time, the bailiff's services, and even, in many documented cases, the executioner. All of this was carefully recorded in the town's financial accounts. Historians have found ledgers from the 15th century detailing these costs. You'd see an entry for 2 sous for bread to feed the pig in prison listed right alongside municipal expenses for road repairs, and the most surreal expense of all sometimes, for the public execution. The condemned animal would be dressed in human clothing. There is a famous 14th century case in Floss, France, where a pig, convicted of the same crime, was dressed in a waistcoat and breeches and given new gloves for its front trotters before being hanged. The cost of the clothing and the new gloves for the executioner were all dutifully paid by the court and noted in the public record. Why this bizarre masquerade herein lies a subject of great debate among historians. Was it a form of ritual humiliation for the animal? A way to fully humanize its crime and therefore its punishment? Or was it to reinforce the gravity of the act for the human spectators? One school of thought argues that these trials were a form of social theater, a public performance designed to restore a sense of order to a community shattered by a chaotic and violent act. By putting the animal through the entire human legal process, arrest, trial, sentencing, execution, the community was reaffirming the power of human justice over the wildness of nature. It was a way of saying, even in the face of random tragedy, our laws, our order, and our God are in control. But other scholars argue this view is too modern, that it dismisses the genuine beliefs of the people at the time. They contend that for the medieval mind, the line between the human and animal worlds was more porous. They believed animals could be agents of the devil, capable of genuine malice. To them, the pig wasn't just a beast that acted on instinct, it was a sinner that had knowingly committed a crime. Therefore, it had to be punished in a way that satisfied both human and divine law. The trial wasn't just a show, it was a necessary spiritual cleansing. The question of whether the judge and jury truly saw a moral agent in the pig, or if they were simply enacting a well-established legal ritual, is something academics are still trying to fully understand. Your Honor, members of the jury, he begins, his voice calm and measured. We are here today under the jurisdiction of this secular court, the court of man. But let us not forget that all justice flows from God. His opening gambit is to subtly shift the framework. He's not just talking about local laws anymore, he's invoking a higher authority. This is your entry point into understanding the 2 parallel legal universes that operated in the Middle Ages, the secular courts and the ecclesiastical or church courts. The secular courts, like the one you're in now, were concerned with crimes that had an immediate, physical victim, murder, assault, theft. These were breaches of the king's peace and the community's safety. When an individual animal, like this sow, was accused of killing a person, it was seen as a direct harm to a human being, a crime of blood. Therefore, it fell under the jurisdiction of the local magistrate or feudal lord. The punishment was physical and final death. The goal was retribution and the removal of a physical threat. This is why you see individual animals, pigs, goats, horses, even donkeys being tried in these courts. They were treated, for all legal intents and purposes, as individual wrongdoers. But as Beringer continues, you sense he's alluding to a different kind of justice. Is this animal, he gestures vaguely towards the pen, truly the sole author of this tragedy, or is it merely a vessel, an instrument of a greater, unseen force? He's treading a fine line, one that hints at the domain of the church courts. The ecclesiastical courts were an entirely different beast. Pardon the pun, they dealt with matters of faith, heresy, blasphemy, on sins. And this is where the animal trials become even more expansive and, to our eyes, stranger. Church courts didn't prosecute a single pig for murder. They prosecuted entire species for collective crimes. If a plague of locusts devoured the crops, or a swarm of weevils infested the granaries, or a field was overrun by rats. This wasn't seen as a problem for the local sheriff. It was a spiritual problem. It was viewed as a divine punishment for the sins of the community, or worse, as a direct demonic assault. The culprits, the insects and vermin, were seen as an army of Satan, sent to torment the faithful. Therefore, the legal remedy had to be spiritual. You couldn't hang a million locusts, but you could excommunicate them. The process was astonishingly formal. The church would appoint a prosecutor and a defense lawyer. The lawyer, often a brilliant legal mind, would argue on behalf of the pests, and if the verdict was guilty, a bishop would issue a formal writ of anathema or excommunication against the creatures, ordering them, in the name of God, to leave the area and never return. This is the mainstream historical fact: the church's legal machinery was deployed against entire animal populations. This brings us to a fascinatedly bizarre and obscure piece of trivia from these ecclesiastical proceedings. How do you serve a summons to a defendant you can't see and whose name you don't know? The church had a procedure for this. A court official would go to the afflicted field, unroll a parchment, and, in a loud, clear voice, read the summons to the insects or rodents, informing them of the date and time of their trial and warning them of the spiritual consequences of non-appearance. This act was witnessed, notarized, and entered into the court record as proof that the defendants had been legally notified. The delivery of the summons was a crucial, non-negotiable step in the process. The debate among historians here is rich and complex. Why did the church, a powerful and highly intellectual institution, engage in such practices? Some historians, like the famous C.P. Evans, who wrote a seminal book on the topic, believed it was a deadly serious theological matter. They saw it as the church asserting its authority over all of creation, both good and evil. They were literally fighting the devil in the fields and in the courtroom. But other, more cynical historians suggest it was also a clever form of social control and revenue generation. A community, terrified of losing its harvest, would be more than willing to pay tithes and offer donations to the church to fund these spiritual interventions. The trials served to reinforce the church's indispensable role in the daily lives and survival of the people. Was it a genuine act of faith, a legalistic response to a theological problem, or a canny way to keep the collection plates full? The answer is likely a messy combination of all three, and scholars are still entangling the motivations. Back in your courtroom, Maitre Berenger hasn't explicitly mentioned church law, but by invoking unseen forces, he's planting a seed of doubt. He's suggesting that this simple case of a pig and a baby might be more complex, that perhaps it belongs in a different jurisdiction altogether. It's a subtle, clever move. He can't deny the facts: the dead child, the bloody snout, but he can reframe the nature of the crime itself. He's not just defending a pig. He's navigating the intricate, overlapping, and often conflicting legal systems of his time. The magistrate listens patiently, stroking his chin. The fate of the sow hangs in the balance, caught between the laws of men and the laws of God. Maitre Berenger takes a deliberate step closer to the jury. He lowers his voice, drawing them in. Consider the nature of a beast, he says, the sound soft but carrying in the tense silence. Does it possess us, or does it understand the concept of sin? The Holy Scriptures tell us that man is made in God's image, blessed with reason and free will. An animal, however, acts on instinct, on base impulse. It knows no right from wrong. He's laying the groundwork for a defense. But woven into it is a profound and disturbing theological idea that underpinned many of these trials. He continues, if this creature, he gestures again, a little more dismissively this time, is incapable of moral reasoning, then it cannot be guilty of a moral crime like murder. An act of malice requires a mind capable of malice. This seems logical, almost modern, but then he pivots. Unless, he adds, his voice dropping to a near whisper, that mind was not its own. The air in the room chills. The peasants at the back shift uncomfortably. He's not just talking about a pig anymore. He's talking about the devil. This is the dark, theological engine humming beneath the floorboards of the courtroom, the widespread medieval belief that animals could be possessed by demons or act as agents of Satan. This wasn't a fringe theory, it was a deeply ingrained part of the worldview, supported by scripture and preached from the pulpit. The natural world was a battlefield between God and the devil, and animals were often seen as pawns, or worse, willing participants on the wrong side. The mainstream historical knowledge here is that the belief in demonic possession extended far beyond humans. A cat with strange habits, a bull that suddenly turned aggressive, a pig that committed a shocking act, these could all be interpreted as signs of demonic influence. You can see the idea taking root in the faces of the jury. They live in a world of constant, low-level fear. Their crops fail because of a curse from a spiteful neighbor. Their children get sick from a fever sent by an evil spirit. The devil isn't an abstract concept, he's a real, active presence in their daily lives, constantly looking for a crack to get in. And an animal, lacking a human soul and the protection of baptism, was seen as a particularly vulnerable entry point. This is where the infamous witch trials and the animal trials intersect. The legal and theological arguments used in both were often eerily similar. The Malleus Maleficum, the notorious 15th century witch hunting manual, explicitly discusses how witches used animals as their familiars, demonic spirits in animal form that did their bidding. A witch might send her cat to sour a neighbor's milk or her toad to inflict sickness. Therefore, when an animal committed a crime, it was often investigated not just as a standalone event, but as potential evidence of witchcraft in the community. Was this pig's owner, Jacques Pinchot, a secret sorcerer? Did he command the pig to attack the child? The animal trial could become the first thread to unravel a much larger, more terrifying investigation. Now for the obscure, almost bizarre detail that stems from this belief. If an animal could be possessed by a demon, it followed that an animal could also be a vessel for a saint. While tales of demonic possession in animals are common, there are also scattered, lesser-known hagiographies stories of saints' lives that describe the opposite. There's the story of Saint Francis of Assisi preaching to the birds, of course, but there are more specific tales. For instance, the legend of Saint Guinefort, a greyhound in 13th century France who was venerated as a folk saint. The story goes that the dog saved a baby from a snake but was mistakenly killed by the child's father, who thought the dog had attacked his son. Upon discovering the truth, the family buried the dog in a well and treated its grave as a shrine, believing the heroic dog could perform miracles, particularly in healing sick children. The official church was horrified and spent decades trying to suppress the cult of the holy dog, declaring it heretical. It shows the incredible fluidity of the boundary. If a dog could be a saint, surely a pig could be a sinner. The academic debate on this point is fascinating. Did the judges and lawyers truly believe in these demonic explanations? Or were they a convenient legal fiction? Some historians argue that it was a very real belief, and to dismiss it is to misunderstand the medieval mind entirely. They point to the meticulous records and the theological treatises written at the time as proof. To them, the trial was a spiritual exorcism as much as a legal proceeding. But other scholars take a more functionalist view. They argue that blaming the devil was a useful social mechanism. It provided a supernatural explanation for a natural tragedy, which was more comforting than pure, random chance. More cynically, it could also deflect blame. It was easier to hang a demonic pig than to accuse an negligent parent or to admit that a valuable livestock animal had simply and inexplicably gone rogue. The devil made him do it. Defense was, perhaps, the ultimate legal loophole. Maitre Beringer is now wrapping up his point. Therefore, Your Honor, I do not argue that this tragedy did not occur. I argue that the defendant in that pen is not the true culprit. The true culprit is the one who whispered in its ear, who guided its teeth. To punish this dumb beast is to punish the arrow, not the archer. This case, I contend, belongs not in the court of man, but in the court of God, which alone has the power to cast out such evil. He's brilliantly turned the prosecution's case on its head. He hasn't exonerated the pig's body, but he has attempted to absolve its non-existent mind. He has transformed a simple murderer into a victim of demonic possession. The jury looks utterly captivated and deeply disturbed. The fate of the sow now rests on whether the magistrate sees her as a criminal or as a crime scene. The magistrate, Jean Levier, leans back, his fingers steep lead. He listens to Maitre Bear Duress' demonic possession argument, his face impassive. HES heard this kind of thing before. It's a classic move. But for the law to function, for this trial to even be possible, there's a fundamental concept that has to be accepted by everyone in the room. A concept so alien to us now that it requires a mental leap. You look at the pig, currently dozing in a sliver of sunlight, and have to grapple with the central legal fiction of the day in the eyes of this court. That pig is a person. Not a human person, of course, but a legal person. This is the core principle that makes the whole surreal spectacle possible. In modern law, we mostly associate legal personality with corporations, fictitious entities that can own property, enter into contracts, sue, and be sued. In the medieval period, this concept was applied much more broadly and, frankly, more weirdly. The idea, inherited from Roman law and adapted by medieval thinkers, was that any entity capable of acting and causing effects in the world could, in theory, be brought under the umbrella of the law. You're witnessing the practical application of this, the extension of a form of legal personhood to an animal. This is why the proceedings are so formal. The pig must be present in court. It must be formally charged. It must be given legal representation. These aren't just quirky customs, they are legal necessities. If the animal wasn't treated as a legal person, the trial would have no standing. The court would have no jurisdiction. The entire process would crumble into a mere mob lynching, which is precisely what the legal system, in its own way, was trying to prevent. By granting the pig its temporary, limited legal status, the community could deal with the problem through the ordered, rational to them process of law rather than through chaotic vengeance. This brings us to a wonderfully strange and niche detail of these trials, the concept of legal precedent as it applied to animals. Because animals weren't right in court, the outcomes of their cases could, and sometimes did, serve as precedent for later animal trials. Lawyers defending an animal would comb through court records to find previous cases with similar circumstances. For instance, a lawyer defending a bull that had gored a man might argue that in a previous case from another town, a bull in a similar situation was acquitted because it had been provoked. They would present this not as a mere story, but as a legal argument. This created a bizarre, parallel body of case law pertaining exclusively to animal defendants. Imagine a law library with a dusty, leather-bound volume titled Bovine Jurisprudence or Porcini Precedents. It sounds like a fantasy, but in a practical sense, that's what these lawyers were building, case by meticulous case. The historical debate around this issue of animal legal personality is profound. Was this a serious intellectual and legal exercise? Or was it a sign of a fundamental misunderstanding of the law itself? The great legal historian Frederick Pollock famously quipped that the jurists who presided over these trials were in a stage of thought when the distinction between an agent and an instrument was not firmly grasped. He essentially argued that they were eagerly primitive, unable to see that a pig was to law an instrument of harm, not a moral agent. This view held for a long time that the whole practice was an embarrassing, superstitious phase in legal history. However, more recent scholarship has pushed back against this. Historians like Peter Denzel Bocker and Dexter Cohen argue that dismissing it as primitive is anachronistic. They contend that for medieval society, this was a perfectly logical extension of their worldview. In a universe created by God where everything had a purpose and a place in a grand hierarchy, an animal wasn't just an it was a creature of God, subject to his laws and, by extension, the laws of man which were supposed to reflect divine justice. They argue that the trials were not a failure to grasp a distinction, but a deliberate application of a different kind of logic, one that saw the entire cosmos as a single, legally ordered system. Are we looking at a system in its infancy? Or a completely different, internally consistent system that we struggle to comprehend? The jury is still out, so to speak. Maitre Berenger is now using this very concept to his advantage. The law requires that a defendant be properly summoned and notified of the charges. He declares, his voice ringing with procedural authority. Was this pig properly notified? Can she understand the gravity of the charges read against her? The law demands a confession or a steadfast denial. We have received only silence. A silence that, in a human defendant, might be taken as guilt, but in a beast, can only be taken as a lack of comprehension. He's using the logic of legal personhood to dismantle the very possibility of a fair trial. If you're going to treat the pig like a person, he argues, you have to go all the way. And if you go all the way, you quickly arrive at a dead end of absurdity, and absurdity he is now skillfully using to protect his client. The magistrate drums his fingers on the oak table. The prosecutor looks flustered, leafing through his notes for a counter-argument. The simple, brutal fact of a dead child has been complicated by theology, procedure, and the mind-bending question of whether the snoring sow in the corner is, for this one day, a person in the eyes of the law. The magistrate signals for the proceedings to continue, and the prosecutor, recovering his composure, calls for the pig's owner, Jacques Pinchet, to come forward. I nervous. Where the beaten man detaches himself from the crowd and shuffles to the front. He keeps his eyes on the floor. This trial is not just about his pig, it's about him, his livelihood, and his standing in this tight-knit community. His testimony brings into focus one of the most well-documented and emblematic cases in the history of animal trials, the 1457 trial of a sow and her 6 piglets in the French village of Savigny. As Pinchet begins to answer the prosecutor's questions in a low mumble, your mind drifts to that historical case, a perfect microcosm of the whole phenomenon. In Savigny, a sow was accused of a crime almost identical to the one you're witnessing, attacking and killing a 5-year-old boy named Jean Martin, a common name, it seems, for victims in these tales. The sow was arrested and put on trial, but what made the Savigny case so memorable was that her 6 piglets, found at the scene with blood on their snouts, were charged alongside her as accomplices. The court proceedings were, as always, meticulously recorded. The sow, the principal defendant, was found guilty of murder. The evidence was considered overwhelming. Her sentence was death by hanging from a gallows tree. This was standard procedure. The expected outcome for a capital crime committed by an animal. The truly fascinating part of the trial, however, concerned the fate of the 6 piglets. The prosecutor argued that they were complicit. They were found at the scene, covered in the victim's blood, by the letter of the law. They were accessories to the crime and deserved the same fate as their mother. The community, horrified by the death of a child, likely wanted to see maximum retribution. It was a moment of legal and social peril. But then, just as you're seeing here with Maitre Berenger, the piglets were assigned a defense lawyer. His name, Master History, is recorded simply as the counsel for the defense, and he made a brilliant argument. He didn't dispute the facts. He didn't claim the piglets were innocent of having blood on their snouts. Instead, he argued for clemency based on their youth and the corrupting influence of their mother. He presented them as impressionable children led astray by a bad example. He essentially argued that they were too young to have formed criminal intent and that they had simply followed their mother's lead. As all young animals do, he put their mother's bad parenting on trial, not their own actions. This brings us to a wonderfully specific and odd detail about the Savigny case. The final verdict hinged on the testimony of the local community and the lord of the manor, a man named Jean de Bailly. The court, after hearing the defense lawyer's plea, turned to the community for a character reference. So to speak, for the piglets. The historical records state that the villagers and the lord vouched for the good character of the young pigs, attesting that they had not been seen engaging in any other criminal behavior. Furthermore, there was no positive proof that they had actually participated in the attack, beyond being present. Their mother's guilt, the court decided, was not enough to condemn them. It was a plea for leniency based on mitigating circumstances and, essentially, a lack of prior offenses. Based on this plea and the community's testimony, the court rendered its verdict. The sow was executed. The 6 piglets were acquitted due to their youth and their mother's negative influence. They were released back into the care of their owner, on the condition that he provide a surety for their future good behavior. The owner had to essentially post a bond, guaranteeing his piglets wouldn't get into any more trouble. The document concludes with the bill for the proceedings, including the cost of keeping the entire pig family fed during their incarceration. The historical debate surrounding the Savigny case is a classic one. Was this an act of genuine legal reasoning or an elaborate piece of social theatre? With a practical outcome, one camp argues that this shows the legal system working properly within its own bizarre framework. The court weighed evidence, heard a defense, considered mitigating factors, age, and delivered a nuanced verdict. It demonstrates a commitment to procedural fairness, even for piglets. It wasn't just a blind lust for vengeance. The other camp suggests a more pragmatic interpretation. A sow that has killed a human is a dangerous liability and must be disposed of. Killing it serves both justice and public safety. But 6 healthy piglets that was valuable property. They represented a significant source of future food and income for their owner and, by extension, the community. Destroying them would have been an economic waste. The trial, in this view, was a ritual that allowed the community to satisfy its need for justice by executing the main culprit, while finding a clever legal justification to spare the valuable assets. The acquittal of the piglets was not so much a triumph of law as a triumph of economic common sense. Wrapped in the comforting language of a legal verdict, the truth, as always, is probably somewhere in between a blend of sincere belief in the process and a keen awareness of its real-world consequences. Back in your 15th century courtroom, the owner, Jacques Pintet, is being dismissed from the stand. Maitre Beringer watches him go, a thoughtful look on his face. The Savigny case would have been known among lawyers of his kind. Perhaps he's thinking about it now. His own client is a sow, like the one in Savigny. But there are no piglets to defend. No easy path to a partial victory. For his client, it's all or nothing. He has to save the mother this time. Maitre Beringer rises to his feet again. The magistrate gives him a nod, and a hush falls over the room. Now is the time for the core of the defense. You've heard the theological arguments and the procedural objections. Now, you're about to witness the craft of the animal lawyer in action. He doesn't have DNA evidence or forensic reports. He has rhetoric, logic, and a deep understanding of the community's fears and beliefs. Your Honor, he begins, his tone shifting from confrontational to something more reasonable, more collaborative. The prosecution has painted a grim picture, and we do not dispute the tragedy that has befallen the Martin family. A child is gone. The grief is real. The community demands justice. He validates their anger and sorrow first. It's a classic lawyer's tactic, as effective now as it was then. HES not fighting them, HES trying to guide them. But justice, he continues, must be precise. It must be aimed at the truly guilty party. He walks slowly towards the pig pen, but he doesn't look at the animal. He looks at its owner, Jacques Pintet, who is now back in the crowd, trying to make himself small. We have established that a beast lacks the moral reason to commit a crime, but let us, for a moment, set aside the question of demonic influence. Let us consider a simpler, more worldly possibility in negligence. The crowd murmurs, this is a direct shot, not at a demon, but at one of their own. It's a risky move. Is it not the duty of a farmer to control his livestock to keep a sow? Particularly one who has recently farrowed and is known to be protective and aggressive. Properly pendant away from the public, he lets the question hang in the air. The animal did what its nature compelled it to do. It is, perhaps, the failure of the human to restrain that nature that is the true crime here. This was a common and often successful defense strategy. The mainstream historical knowledge is that lawyers for accused animals frequently tried to shift the blame to the owner. It was a way of acknowledging the harm done while arguing that the animal itself lacked culpability. This transformed the trial from a criminal case against the animal to something more akin to a modern liability hearing. The pig was no longer a murderer, but a weapon, and the owner was the one who had failed to secure it. This had the added benefit of making logical sense, even to us. Of course the owner is responsible, but in their world, this wasn't the default position. The animal's guilt had to be legally disproven or transferred first. The job of being an animal's lawyer was a legitimate, if unusual, legal specialty. These weren't charlatans or fools. In many cases, especially the ecclesiastical trials of pests, they were some of the brightest legal minds of their day. They were called advocates, diaboli, devil's advocate in a colloquial sense, tasked with making the best possible case for a seemingly indefensible client, and they took it seriously, because a loss could have real consequences, not just a dead pig, but a precedent set, or worse, the implication that the lawyer hadn't fought hard enough against the forces of evil. This leads to a fascinating, unslightly comical niche, detail the professional anxieties of an animal lawyer. What happens if your clients, say, a swarm of weevils, refuse to cooperate in one documented 16th century case? The famous lawyer Bartholomew Chasney was defending a group of rats against an ecclesiastical court summons. The rats, unsurprisingly, failed to appear in court. The prosecutor moved for a default judgment against them, but Chasney stood up and argued that his clients couldn't possibly appear. Why? Because the summons had been issued to all rats in the diocese, a large and diverse group. He argued that his clients were widely dispersed and that a single summons was insufficient to notify them all. Furthermore, he argued, the journey to the courthouse would be a perilous one for a rat, fraught with danger from their mortal enemies, the cats, who would be lying in wait. He stated that the court had a duty to guarantee the defendant's safe passage to the proceedings. If the court could not ensure his client's safety from cats, they could not be faulted for their non-appearance. The court, incredibly, accepted this argument and delayed the trial. The historical debate here revolves around the sincerity of these lawyers. Were men like Chasney true believers in the system, using their formidable legal skills to ensure that even the lowliest of God's creatures received a fair hearing, as the law demanded, or were they brilliant legal satirists, using the absurdity of the situation to expose the logical flaws within the system itself? Some historians see them as pious and dutiful officers of the court, upholding a system they believed in. They were simply doing their job to the best of their ability. Others see them as proto-enlightenment figures, using irony and procedural minutiae as a weapon. By making these outlandish arguments with a straight face, were they secretly mocking the very foundations of the process? It's a debate about intent, something notoriously difficult to prove from historical documents. We see the absurd argument about the cats. We can't know for certain if Chasney made it with a twinkle in his eye. Back in the courtroom, Maitre Barringer hasn't gone quite as far as Chasney, but his strategy is clear. He's offering the court a way out, an off-ramp from the bizarre logic of animal guilt. Punish the man, not the beast, he implores. Fine Jop in check for his carelessness. Make him pay restitution to the Martin family. This is a justice that is swift, practical, and addresses the root cause: human error. Hanging this pig will not bring the child back, but it will punish a creature that knows no better. A fine, however, will teach a lesson to all farmers here to better guard their animals. That is a justice that serves the future. He has given the magistrate and the jury a choice. They can follow the path of ritual and tradition, condemning the animal as a vessel of evil, or they can choose a more pragmatic path, one that reaffirms social order by punishing human negligence. The entire case now balances on this knife's edge between the supernatural and the practical. The prosecutor, seeing his case against the pig being methodically dismantled, decides to fight fire with fire, or rather, absurdity with absurdity. He rises and says, Maitre Barringer speaks of the nature of beasts. of an animal simply following its instincts. But what happens when an animal's instinct leads it to commit an act so profoundly unnatural, so contrary to the order God has ordained, that it can only be seen as a monstrous crime? He lets the question settle, then delivers his example. What of the case of the rooster of Basel? You can almost feel a collective shiver go through the room, a mix of grim fascination and holy dread, even in a world used to strange trials. The case of the rooster of Basel, which took place in 1474, was in a category of its own. It wasn't about an animal acting like an animal. It was about an animal allegedly acting like something else entirely. The rooster in question was put on trial for a truly heinous and, you might think, impossible crime, laying an egg. This is the central, mind-boggling historical fact of the case. A rooster was formally accused, prosecuted, and ultimately convicted for the unnatural crime of laying an egg. To the modern mind, this is biological nonsense. A rooster is a male chicken, it cannot lay an egg. The people of Basel in the 15th century would have known this basic biological fact as well. They were not ignorant of how farm animals work. So why the trial? Because this was not about biology. It was about demonology. According to a pervasive medieval superstition, an egg laid by a rooster was no ordinary egg. It was a cockatrice egg. A cockatrice was a mythical beast, a two-legged dragon-like creature with a rooster's head, said to be so venomous that its gaze or breath could kill. And the only way a cockatrice could be born was from a rooster's egg, which then had to be hatched by a toad or a serpent. The existence of such an egg was therefore not just an unnatural oddity, it was the first step in the creation of a diabolical monster that could potentially lay waste to the entire town. The rooster wasn't just being a biological anomaly, it was consorting with the devil to unleash hell on earth. The trial was conducted with the utmost seriousness. The rooster was arrested and imprisoned. A prosecutor was appointed to argue for the town's safety, and a defense lawyer was appointed for the rooster. The prosecution's case was simple: the egg existed. It had been found in the rooster's nest. Therefore, the rooster must have laid it, and because laying an egg is an unnatural act for a rooster, it was proof of demonic interference. The rooster was, in essence, being accused of being a sorcerer or a true love Satan. This is where you find a truly fantastic, niche detail about the case. The rooster's lawyer, a man named Jacob Hurt, mounted a spirited defense. He didn't deny the existence of the egg. Instead, he argued that the laying of the egg was an involuntary act, a freak of nature, and that there was no evidence of his client's complicity with the devil. He argued that his client had no history of such behavior and that the act itself, while unusual, was not accompanied by any proof of malicious intent. He essentially pleaded not guilty by reason of biological anomaly. He even brought in expert witnesses to testify that sometimes strange things just happen in nature. It was a plea for a rational, scientific explanation in an age of superstition. It didn't work. The court, siding with the terrified populace and the prosecutor, found the rooster guilty. The sentence was death, but not a simple beheading. The punishment had to fit the supernatural nature of the crime. The rooster, along with the demonic egg it had laid, was taken to a public square and burned at the stake, just like a human heretic or witch. The executioner, a man named Hans or YCH, is said to have ceremonially cut the rooster open first to see if it contained any other eggs, a sort of demonic autopsy. Finding none, he consigned the rooster and the egg to the flames, a ritual cleansing designed to destroy the evil at its source. The historical debate here is potent. Was this mass hysteria? Was the town of Basel so gripped by fear of the supernatural that they lost all reason? Some historians argue yes. They see the trial as a classic case of social panic, where a community projects its anxieties onto a scapegoat, in this case, a poo chicken. The rooster became the focal point for all their fears about plagues, crop failures, and demonic influence. However, other scholars argue it was more calculated. They suggest the trial was a powerful piece of civic and religious propaganda. By publicly and ritually destroying this unnatural creature, The town's leaders, both secular and religious, were demonstrating their power to protect the community. They were showing that they were vigilant, that they could identify and purge evil, and that their authority was absolute. It was a show of strength, a performance of order in the face of chaos. Was it genuine belief or a cynical power play? The answer is likely wrapped up in the smoke from that 15th century pyre. We can read the court documents, but we can't read the minds of the judges who condemned a chicken to be burned for a crime against nature. In your courtroom, the prosecutor's mention of the Boswell rooster has the desired effect. The jury looks pale. The idea of a simple pig being possessed is one thing, the idea of animals actively participating in the creation of monsters is another level of terror entirely. The prosecutor has successfully raised the stakes. He's not just prosecuting a pig for murder anymore. He's implying that if they let this act of unnatural violence go unpunished, it could be the start of something far, far worse. The pressure on the magistrate and jury has just been dialed up to an almost unbearable degree. He calls the court to order and announces a brief recess for the jury to deliberate. As the jury files out, your attention is drawn to the bailiff, who is speaking in low tones to a grim-looking man who has been standing by the door. This man is dressed in black, and he carries himself with a strange mixture of civic importance and social ostracism. He is the executioner. His presence here, before a verdict is even rendered, tells you everything you need to know about the likely outcome. His job is not just to end a life, it's to stage a performance. This is where you step into the grim theater of medieval punishment. The execution of a condemned animal was no different from the execution of a human criminal. In fact, in many ways, it was deliberately made to be identical. This is the key historical point. The punishment was designed to mirror the human legal process to its final, bloody conclusion. The goal was to affirm that the same justice applies to all criminals, regardless of species. If an animal was to be treated as a legal person in the trial, it must be treated as a legal person on the gallows. The most common method of execution for animals like pigs and cattle, convicted of capital crimes, was hanging. This was seen as a particularly shameful death, reserved for common murderers and thieves. The animal would be transported from the jail to the public gallows, often in the same cart used for human convicts. The procession through the town served as a public spectacle, a final warning to the populace. The town crier would walk ahead, announcing the crime and the sentence. It was a somber, ritualized parade. Once at the gallows, the ceremony would continue. This is where you encounter some truly mind-bending details, testaments to the bizarre literalism of the age. As mentioned before, in the 1396 Floss case, the condemned sow was not only hanged, but was first dressed in human clothes. The court records meticulously detail the purchase of a new waistcoat, breeches, and gloves for the pig, along with payment to the executioner for carrying out the sentence in this specific manner. This act of dressing the animal was not merely a bizarre flourish. It was a powerful symbolic act. It visually transformed the animal from a beast into a felon, reinforcing the idea that it was being punished for a human-like crime. It was the final step in the legal fiction of its personhood. Another peculiar detail from the records of these executions concerns the executioner's fee. The executioner was a municipal employee who was paid for his services on a per-job basis. The town's account books show payments for hanging a human murderer right next to payments for hanging a porcini one. But sometimes, the job was more complicated. In one Swiss case, a bull that had gored a man was sentenced to hang. The executioner, however, found it logistically difficult to hang such a large and powerful animal. He petitioned the court, and the sentence was officially and formally commuted to beheading. The court records show the change in sentence and the corresponding adjustment in the executioner's fee, as a beheading was apparently a different line item on his price list. The historical debate around this intense ritualism is captivating. Why this obsessive need for ceremony? The functionalist school of thought argues, as before, that this was all about social order. These executions were a form of state theater, in a time before mass media. A public execution was one of the most powerful tools the authorities had to communicate their power and the rule of law. by making the animal's execution as formal and public as a human's. The state was sending a clear message: all disorder, whether human or animal in origin, would be met with the full, ritualized force of justice. It was a demonstration of control in a world that often felt frighteningly out of control. A different perspective, however, comes from cultural historians who focus on the concept of the body politic. They argue that a crime like murder was seen as a wound on the entire community. The execution was a form of ritual surgery, designed to excise the diseased member, be it a human criminal or a criminal animal, to restore the health of the social body. The ceremony, the public procession, the final act on the gallows, these were all part of the healing process for the community. The shame of the gallows was not just for the convict, but a way for the town to collectively purge itself of the crime. As the jury files back in, a heavy silence descends. The foreman, a grim-faced baker, refuses to look at Maitre Beringer or the pig's owner. He looks only at the magistrate. "We have reached a verdict," he says, his voice flat. The magistrate nods. "On the charge of murder, how do you find the defendant?" The foreman takes a deep breath. "Guilty." A wave of relief and grim satisfaction seems to wash over the crowd. Justice, in their eyes, has been done. The magistrate turns to the executioner. "You will carry out the sentence tomorrow at dawn. The animal is to be hanged by the neck from the public gallows until it is dead, so that all may see that the law is upheld." Maitre Beringer slumps onto his bench. He has lost. All his sophisticated arguments about theology, negligence, and legal personhood have crumbled in the face of a simple, powerful emotion: fear. The sow in the pen lets out a soft grunt in her sleep, oblivious to the fact that her brief, strange career as a legal person is about to come to a ceremonial and very public end. The ritual of justice is now complete, and all that remains is the ritual of punishment. The scene dissolves. The oppressive air of the secular courtroom, with its verdict of blood and throat, fades away. You find yourself standing not in a cramped town hall, but in the open air, on a sun-drenched hillside in the south of France. The skies are brilliant blue. Below you, vineyards stretch out in neat, green rows. It's beautiful, peaceful, but the group of men you're standing with are not admiring the view. They are staring at the vines with expressions of pure despair. An old farmer picks up a vine leaf, and you see that it's riddled with holes, chewed to a skeleton of its former self. He crumbles it in his hand, dust to dust. "The snout beetles," he mutters, his voice tight with anger and desperation. "They'll leave us with nothing. This isn't a single, identifiable criminal like a pig. This is an army, an infestation, a creep-in, crawling menace that threatens the livelihood of the entire region. This is not a job for the local magistrate and his gallows. This is a matter for a higher power. This is a case for the ecclesiastical court. Your journey now takes you into the second major arena of animal justice. While secular courts dealt with individual animal felons, the church courts took on a far grander and, arguably, more bizarre task: the legal prosecution of entire populations of vermin on pests. This is the mainstream historical fact that often stretches modern credulity to its breaking point. For centuries, the Catholic Church used its full legal and spiritual authority to put insects, rodents, and other pests on trial. The logic, as you've already glimpsed, was theological. A plague of locusts, weevils, rats, or in this case, snout beetles, a type of weevil notorious for attacking grapevines, was not a random ecological event. It was a divine judgment. God had sent this plague to punish the people for their sins, their lack of piety, their failure to pay tithes, their moral laxity. The swarm was a tool of God's wrath. Alternatively, and often concurrently, the plague could be seen as a direct assault by Satan, using his legions of crawling creatures to torment God's faithful and destroy their sustenance. Either way, the solution was not poison or traps. The solution was litigation. The process began with a formal complaint, a delegation of villagers, led by their parish priest, would travel to the diocesan headquarters and file a legal petition with the bishop's court. They would describe the devastation, quantify the damages to their crops, and formally request that the court take action against the offending creatures. This was not a plea for a miracle, it was the filing of a lawsuit. The court would then begin its proceedings. A judge, usually a high-ranking church official with a background in canon law, would be appointed. A prosecutor would be chosen to represent the interests of the villagers, and, crucially, a lawyer would be appointed to defend the accused pests. This was considered an essential part of due process. Even an army of beetles sent by the devil deserved a fair trial. The church, in its own view, was demonstrating its supreme commitment to justice. A justice so perfect that it extended even to its enemies. This is where you encounter a niche detail so peculiar it perfectly captures the spirit of the whole affair. In some of these trials, particularly against creatures like field mice or moles that lived underground, the defense lawyer would make a clever procedural argument. He would claim his clients had a prior claim to the land. He would argue, with a completely straight face, that the mice and their ancestors had been occupying the fields and feeding on the roots of the crops long before the human villagers had arrived to plant them. Therefore, his clients were not trespassers. They were the original inhabitants, merely exercising their ancestral rights to sustenance. The humans were the interlopers. This argument, documented in several cases, transformed the pests from criminals into something akin to an indigenous population defending its territory. The historical debate around these ecclesiastical trials is, if anything, even more heated than the one surrounding the secular trials. What on earth was the church thinking? The traditional, and perhaps most charitable, view is that this was an act of profound faith and pastoral care. The church was providing its flock with a structured, ritualized way to cope with overwhelming disaster. In a world with no scientific recourse, the trial offered hope. It gave people a sense of agency. They couldn't stop the beetles themselves, but they could participate in a legal and spiritual process that might. The trial was a form of communal therapy, a way of managing mass anxiety and reaffirming faith in God's ultimate power. A more cynical interpretation, however, points to the power and money involved. These trials were not free. The community had to pay court costs, and the proceedings always included calls for public prayer, fasting, and, most importantly, renewed devotion and donations to the church. The trial process invariably ended with a reaffirmation of the church's central role in the community's spiritual and physical survival. Some historians argue that the trials were a brilliant piece of institutional reinforcement. They turned a natural disaster into a religious event, with the church positioned as the only institution capable of providing a solution. Back on the hillside, the farmers decide to act. They will send an allegation to the bishop. They will file their complaint. They will trust in the power of the church's justice. As they trudge back towards their village, their faces are still grim, but now there's a flicker of something else in their eyes, a plan. They are no longer helpless victims of a mindless swarm. They are now plaintiffs in a lawsuit against the forces of darkness. The great case of the people, the snout beetles, is about to begin. The bishop's court has accepted the case. The wheels of ecclesiastical justice have begun to turn, slowly and deliberately. You are now inside a dusty office, lined with shelves of heavy, leather-bound books on canon law. A young, earnest-looking clerk is tasked with the first crucial step of the legal process, drafting the summons. This isn't a simple notice, it's a formal, legal document, filled with Latin phrases and intricate legal boilerplate. But the central challenge isn't what to write, it's who to deliver it to. The clerk dips his quill in the inkpot, hesitates, and looks at the senior judge for guidance. "Your Excellency," he asks, "to whom shall I address the summons and how are we to serve it upon them?" This is the fundamental, practical problem that made these ecclesiastical trials so different and, in many ways, so much more abstract than the secular ones. You can lead a pig to a courthouse. You can't do the same for 10,000 beetles scattered across 100 vineyards. The judge, A man who has seen this all before explains the established procedure. The law, he states, requires that the defendants be given a fair and public notification of the charges against them and be summoned to appear in court to defend themselves. Failure to do so would render the entire trial invalid. This commitment to procedural fairness is absolute, even when the defendants are insects. This is the core historical point. The serving of the summons was a non-negotiable, and often highly theatrical, part of the proceedings. The solution was a kind of public proclamation. The court would dispatch a bailiff, often accompanied by the parish priest and other witnesses from the afflicted village, to the scene of the crime. This official party would march in a solemn procession to the very fields and vineyards where the pests were causing devastation. Once there, the bailiff would unroll the formal summons, a long scroll of parchment, and read it aloud in a booming voice. You can picture the scene: a group of somber men in robes standing in the middle of a field. The bailiff reading a complex legal document to an audience of uncomrephantide insects. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the summons might begin, and by the authority of this ecclesiastical court of the diocese, we do hereby command and admonish you, the destructive vermin known as snout beetles, who do infest these lands, to cease your illegal depredations and to appear before this court on the third Sunday after Easter, to answer the charges brought against you by the good people of this parish. Should you fail to appear, a judgment shall be rendered in your absence. The entire proclamation would be read, first in Latin, the language of the church, and then in the local vernacular, so the human witnesses could understand. This act of reading the summons was then formally documented. The priest and the other witnesses would sign an affidavit testifying that they had seen the bailiff serve the notice in the legally prescribed manner. This document would be returned to the court and entered into the official record as proof of service. The law had been satisfied. The beetles had been notified. This brings us to a wonderfully niche detail that highlights the almost surreal logic at play. What if the pests were something more mobile and widespread, like mice or rats, who infested not just the fields but the entire town? The procedure had to be adapted. In one famous case against rats in the French region of Autun, the court ordered the summons to be read aloud from the pulpits of all the churches in the affected areas for several consecutive Sundays. The logic was that since the rats were believed to be everywhere, infesting barns, homes, and even the churches themselves, a public proclamation from the pulpit was the most effective way to ensure the message reached them. The idea of a priest earnestly reading a legal summons to a congregation of rodents during a church service is the epitome of this entire historical episode. The historical debate around this practice is fascinating. Was this a sincere belief that the animals could somehow spiritually or supernaturally receive the summons? Some historians, taking the medieval worldview at face value, argue yes, they contend that for the people of the time, the spoken word, especially when imbued with the authority of the church and spoken in the sacred language of Latin, had a tangible power. The act of proclamation was a spiritual event, a direct challenge to the demonic forces controlling the pests. It wasn't about the beetles literally understanding the words, it was about the power of the holy incantation being unleashed upon them. Other historians, however, see it as a form of legal hygiene. They argue that the canon lawyers were obsessed with procedure. For a verdict to be legitimate in their eyes, every single box had to be checked. The fact that the defendant was a bug was irrelevant. The law required a summons, so a summons there must be. The public reading was the most logical way to fulfill that requirement, however absurd it might seem. It was about satisfying the internal logic of the legal system itself. Regardless of its practical application in the real world, it was the system protecting its own integrity. A more cynical view might even suggest it was a way to prolong the proceedings, adding more steps and thus more importance and cost to the entire affair. Back in the clerk's office, the young man is now diligently writing. He addresses the summons to the violent, destructive creatures, the snout beetles, presently occupying the vineyards of the parish of Barsenville. He includes the charges, the date of the trial, and the dire warnings of what will happen if they fail to appear. The document will soon be ready. The bailiff will be dispatched. The bizarre, solemn ritual of notifying an insect army of its impending lawsuit is about to be performed. A perfect fusion of unwavering faith and bureaucratic obsession. The day of the trial arrives. The snout beetles, unsurprisingly, have failed to show up. The prosecutor for the village stands before the ecclesiastical judge, a stern-faced bishop, and demands an immediate default judgment. Your Excellency, he argues, the defendants were awfully summoned. Their failure to appear is an act of contempt. They have forfeited their right to a defense. We ask the court to proceed directly to sentencing and issue the anathema. It seems like an open and shut case. But then, a man rises from a side bench. He is neither a priest nor a peasant. He is dressed in the robes of a scholar, a man of letters and the law. He carries a heavy satchel of books and scrolls. This is the moment the proceedings get truly interesting. This is the defense attorney for the Beatles, and he is not just any lawyer. He is the most celebrated animal advocate in history, Bartholomew Chasney. Your journey now brings you face to face with a real and truly remarkable historical figure. Bartholomew Chasney, or Barthélemy de Chasnoisy, was a highly respected French jurist in the early 16th century. He wasn't a fringe crank, he was a legal giant who would eventually become the president of the Parliament of Provence, one of the highest legal officers in the land. But he earned his early fame and built his formidable reputation on a series of seemingly impossible cases defending animals in church courts. His work represents the absolute apex of this strange legal practice. Chasney approaches the judge and bows respectfully. Your Excellency, he begins, his voice resonant, confident. My learned colleague calls for a swift judgment. But justice must never be swift at the expense of being just. He doesn't dispute that his clients are absent. Instead, he turns the law itself into his shield. This is where you witness the genius of his craft. He begins with the argument you've heard before, the one he famously used for the rats of Otten. The summons was issued to all beetles in the region, he posits. But my clients are a dispersed and varied population. Some are old and infirm, unable to make the long journey to this court. Others are young and caring for their larvae, unable to abandon their familial duties. He is humanizing them, attributing to them the same obligations and frailties as the people in the courtroom. He is creating a narrative of a beleaguered community, not a malicious army. He continues, building on the logic. Furthermore, the roads between the vineyards and this court are fraught with peril for creatures of their size. Birds of prey, lizards, and other predators lie in wait. The court cannot expect my clients to risk their lives to attend these proceedings unless a guarantee of safe passage is provided. This is the mainstream historical fact about Chasney. He really did use these arguments about the logistical difficulties and dangers of travel to defend his non-human clients. And courts often took them seriously enough to grant delays. But his most brilliant defense, and a wonderfully niche piece of legal history, came in a case involving a plague of locusts. After all procedural delays had been exhausted, the prosecutor finally had Chasney cornered. The locusts were guilty of destroying the crops. The evidence was irrefutable. It seemed a verdict of excommunication was inevitable. This is when Chasney pulled his masterstroke. He opened the Bible. He didn't turn to passages about the devil or demons. He turned to the Old Testament, to the words of the prophet Joel. He read aloud the passage where God himself, speaking to the prophet, refers to the swarming locusts as my great army, which I sent among you. The courtroom would have fallen silent. Chasney had just flipped the entire theological script. The prosecutor had argued that the locusts were an army of Satan, but Chasney, using the unimpeachable word of Scripture, was now arguing that they were, in fact, an army of God. He argued that the locusts were not acting out of malice, nor were they agents of the devil. They were divine instruments, sent by God himself to punish the people for their sins, as the Bible explicitly stated. Therefore, Chasney would have concluded, his voice ringing with theological authority, these creatures are not criminals. They are soldiers of the Almighty. carrying out his divine will. To curse them, to excommunicate them, would be to curse the very agents of God. It would be an act of blasphemy. This was an unanswerable argument. He had used the prosecution's own foundational text, the Bible, to completely dismantle their case. He had transformed the defendants from satanic pests into holy messengers. He didn't save the crops, of course, but he won the case. The court could not possibly issue a curse against what the Bible itself called God's army. The historical debate about chastening is the debate about the entire practice in miniature. Was he a deeply pious man who believed that every creature, even a locust, deserved the most vigorous defense possible under God's and man's law? Did he genuinely see his work as upholding the sacred principles of justice? His own writings, particularly his famous treatise Concilium Primum, where he catalogued all the known animal trials, suggest a man who took the subject with utmost seriousness. He seems to be a true believer in the system. Or was he a masterful lionist, a brilliant legal mind who saw the inherent absurdity of the trials and decided to play the game better than anyone else? Was he, through his meticulous and increasingly outlandish arguments, subtly mocking the entire institution by showing that the internal logic of the system could be used to produce such a paradoxical result, that the pests should be revered, not cursed? Was he exposing the folly of it all? Was he a satirist hiding in the robes of a jurist? This is the great, unanswerable question about the man. We know what he did, but we can never be entirely sure of his motives. Back in your courtroom, the bishop looks intrigued by the young lawyer's arguments. This man, who is clearly a student of the great chastening, he has successfully delayed the trial. He has won his clients, his snout beetles. A little more time. A little more time to do what? Exactly to continue eating the vineyards. Of course, for the lawyer, it's a victory process. For the farmers, it's another week of devastation. And for you, it's a stunning display of how, in this strange world, a good lawyer with a good book could save even a beetle from the wrath of the church. Weeks, perhaps even months, have passed. All of Bartholomew Chasteney's brilliant delaying tactics have been exhausted. The arguments about safe passage have been heard. The pleas for more time for the infirm beetles to arrive have been denied. The court is reconvened for the final time. The defense has no more procedural tricks up its sleeve. The evidence of the ravaged vineyards is presented again, this time with even more desperate testimony from the farmers. The ecclesiastical judge, having shown what he considers to be infinite patience, is now ready to deliver his verdict. He finds the snout beetles guilty, guilty of trespass, guilty of destruction of property, guilty of defying the initial warnings of the court. The moment of sentencing has arrived. But what does that mean in an ecclesiastical court? There will be no gallows, no executioner. The punishment is not physical, but spiritual. It is a punishment wielded through words, faith, and fear. The judge, acting as a conduit for the power of the church, will issue a formal, legal, and spiritual decree. This is the central purpose of the ecclesiastical animal trial, to arrive at a sentence of either exorcism or anathema. The two are slightly different but often used interchangeably in the records. An exorcism is a command, a solemn order for the demonic spirits controlling the pests to depart. An anathema is a full-blown curse, a formal excommunication that separates the creatures from God's grace and consigns them to the powers of darkness. It is the spiritual equivalent of the death penalty. The judge stands, and the room falls into a deep, prayerful silence. He begins a ritualistic chant in Latin, a formal legal preamble that builds in intensity. Then, he delivers the sentence. We, by the authority vested in us by Almighty God and the Holy Mother Church, he intones, his voice echoing in the stone chamber, do hereby admonish and command you, accursed snout beetles, to depart forthwith from these vineyards and fields, to go to a place where you can do no further harm to Christian folk or their sustenance. This first part is the formal command to leave, what you might call the divine eviction notice. It's a direct order to the pests. But often, it came with a very specific, and rather peculiar, addendum. This is a fantastic, niche detail of these sentences. The court would sometimes designate a specific piece of land for the pests to relocate to. The defense lawyer, in a final act of negotiation for his clients, would argue that the creatures had to go somewhere, as they too were God's creation and required sustenance. So the court would formally grant the insects or rodents a tract of land, usually a barren, rocky patch of wilderness owned by no one of importance, where they were legally permitted to live and eat in peace. The sentence was not just an eviction, it was a relocation order, a legally binding zoning ordinance for vermin. After the command to leave comes the curse, the anathema itself. The judge's tone darkens. Should you fail to heed this command, he thunders, we do pronounce upon you our malediction. We curse you in your coming and in your going. We curse you in the fields and in your barrows. We separate you from the community of God's creatures and deliver you into the hands of the devil, to be tormented now and forever. He might then make the sign of the cross, not as a blessing, but as a weapon, sealing the curse. The legal proceeding is over. The spiritual war has been declared. The document containing this sentence would be formally copied, signed, and sealed. It would then be taken back to the village and read aloud once more in the blighted fields. A final, terrifying warning to the unholy invaders. This raises the big, obvious question, which is also a major point of historical debate: did it actually work? What happened when, inevitably, the beetles or the locusts did not pack up and move to their designated patch of wasteland? How did the church and the community rationalize the failure of their most powerful spiritual weapon? The answer was ingenious and, in its own way, perfectly logical within their belief system. The failure was never attributed to the curse itself. The power of the church's anathema was absolute and could not fail. Instead, the failure was blamed on the people. The judge and the priests would explain that the curse had been ineffective because the faith of the community was weak. The villagers had not been pious enough. They harbored secret sins. They had not prayed with sufficient fervor or fasted with sufficient rigor. Their lack of faith had rendered God's weapon useless. So the failure of the curse became proof that the community needed to redouble its religious devotion. It required more public processions, more prayers, more tithes and offerings to purify the parish and make it worthy of divine intervention. In a perfect, self-fulfilling prophecy, the trial's failure to produce a practical result only served to reinforce the church's authority and the community's dependence on it. It was a system that could not lose. Success was proof of the church's power. Failure was proof of the people's sin, for which the church was the only remedy. Some historians see this as the ultimate evidence of the trial's function as a tool of social and religious control. It was a brilliant mechanism for turning natural disasters into opportunities for institutional strengthening. However, other scholars argue for a more psychological interpretation. They suggest this explanation wasn't just a cynical ploy, but a genuinely comforting belief. It's more empowering to believe that the locusts remain because of your own spiritual failings, which you can theoretically correct, than to believe that you are simply helpless in the face of a chaotic and indifferent universe. The belief, however circular, gave people a sense of purpose and a path forward, even amidst the ruin of their crops. The farmers from Bass and Var leave the court, clutching the precious parchment with the bishop's curse. Their faces are a mixture of hope and fear. They have their verdict. They have their spiritual weapon. Now, they must go home and prove they are worthy of its power. The fate of their harvest, they now believe, rests not in the jaws of the beetles, but in the piety of their own hearts. Let's glide away from the grand theatre of the ecclesiastical court and drift back to the grittier reality of the secular trial. You are back in the small, smelly hall with the magistrate, Jean Levier. The sow has been found guilty. The execution set for dawn, but as the initial relief in the room subsides, you focus on a subtle, yet pervasive, element of the entire proceeding: the silence of the accused. Throughout the trial, the pig has done nothing but be a pig. She snorted. She slept. She chewed on her pen. She offered no testimony, no confession, no denial. In a human trial, a defendant's silence can be a powerful, ambiguous statement. It can be interpreted as dignity, defiance, or guilt. But what does it mean when the defendant is an animal? This question of silence was a constant, thorny problem for the courts, and how they interpreted it reveals a great deal about the legal and psychological landscape of the time. The most straightforward interpretation, and the one that prosecution always favored, was that the animal's silence in the face of accusation was a tacit admission of guilt. This is a well-established legal principle. In many human-centric systems, silence implies consent or, in this case, culpability. The prosecutor in the sow's trial would have argued that the animal was given the chance to speak through a lawyer, or by some sign, and its failure to offer any defense was proof of its wicked nature. The court read the animal's muteness as a confirmation of the evidence presented. This is the mainstream historical view of how silence was most often handled, as a legal and practical obstacle that was simply steamrolled by the prosecution. However, for a defense lawyer like Maitre Beringer, the defendant's silence was not a weakness to be overcome, but a powerful tool to be wielded. As you saw, he argued that the pig's silence was not a sign of guilt, but proof of its fundamental lack of comprehension. He framed it not as defiance, but as innocence, the guileless silence of a creature that literally cannot understand the human concept of crime. You cannot hold my client's silence against her, he would have argued, because it is the only state available to her. It is the very essence of her being as a beast. This turned the animal's silence into a legal paradox. The court wanted to treat the animal as a person for the purposes of prosecution, but the defense could use the animal's most obvious non-human trait, its inability to speak, as a shield. This forced the court into a logical corner. If you accept the pig as a legal person, you must accept its right to speak. If it cannot speak, the trial is inherently unfair. This was a brilliant, and often frustratingly effective, defensive loop. This brings us to a truly weird and wonderful niche detail that emerged from this problem: the documented attempts by courts to elicit a confession from an animal through torture, while less common in the more formal French trials. Records from Germany and Switzerland show instances where an accused animal was subjected to pain to see if it would confess by crying out. This practice was a direct and horrifying extension of the logic used on human defendants. In many medieval legal systems, a confession was considered the queen of proofs, and torture was a legally sanctioned method for obtaining one. Applying this to an animal was seen, in some jurisdictions, as a grotesquely logical next step. If the pig squealed when prodded with a hot iron, a court could, and sometimes did, interpret this as a cry of guilt, an admission of its crime. It's a chilling example of the system's determination to force the animal into the human legal framework, by any means necessary. The historical debate around the interpretation of silence is fascinating. Was the legal system's approach to the mute defendant a sign of its deep-seated intellectual dishonesty? Critics argue that it shows the whole enterprise was a sham. The court was determined to reach a guilty verdict to satisfy the community, and it would interpret the animal's silence in whatever way best served that goal. The animal's inability to participate was a mere inconvenience to be brushed aside in the pursuit of a predetermined outcome. It was, in this view, a show trial in the truest sense of the word. However, other historians argue that this is too simplistic. They suggest that the struggle with the animal's silence reveals the court's genuine intellectual and theological struggle. They weren't just ignoring the problem, they were actively trying to solve it within their own belief system. The arguments of lawyers like Beringer and the extreme measures like torture were all part of a sincere, if misguided, attempt to grapple with the central paradox. They were trying to answer the question, how do we achieve justice for a being that cannot participate in our definition of it? The varied and often contradictory responses to the animal's silence. This argument goes, show a system wrestling with a problem it knew was profound, not one that was simply going through the motions. As you watch the guards lead the condemned sow from the courtroom to her cell for her final night, her silence is the most powerful presence in the room. It hangs anear, a silent tribute to the complex legal web that has been woven around her. To the prosecutor, it was the silence of a killer. To the defense lawyer, it was the silence of an innocent beast. To the historian, it is the silence of a different reality. a world of instinct and nature that the human world of words, laws, and rituals can never truly penetrate. The sow's silence is the ultimate symbol of the absurdity of the trial, the great, unanswered question at the heart of the whole affair. The humans have filled that silence with their own fears, their own logic, and their own need for order, but the silence itself remains profound and unbroken. The trial of the sow may be over, but the legal drama of the animal world is not. Let's shift our focus from the star defendant to the supporting cast, a group of participants whose role seems, on the surface, entirely logical, the human witnesses. We've already seen them in the pig's trial, the grieving mother, the neighbor who heard a scream. Their testimony was crucial, but the practice of calling human witnesses to testify about the actions and even the character of an animal defendant led to some of the most surreal scenes in medieval legal history. Imagine yourself now not in a trial for murder, but in a slightly less dramatic but equally serious case in a Swiss village. The defendant is not a pig, but a donkey. They charge public nuisance and property damage. The donkey, owned by a local man, has a habit of getting loose, wandering into people's gardens and eating their prize-winning cabbages. After numerous informal warnings, the fed-up villagers have taken the donkey's owner and the donkey itself to court. The prosecutor, a self-important local official, begins to call his witnesses. One by one, villagers come forward to testify against the donkey. I saw it with my own two eyes, a woman declares, pointing an accusatory finger at the donkey, which is tied to a post near the defendant's pen. It was in my garden last Tuesday, bold as brass, eating the very cabbage I was planning to enter into the village fair. A second witness, a stern-looking farmer, corroborates the story. That beast is a menace, he states, addressing the judge. It has no respect for fences or for property. I have seen it knock over my fenced ways to get at my turnips. This is the straightforward, mainstream part of the process, humans testifying to the factual events and damages caused by an animal. This was the bread and butter of such minor trials, a formal way to resolve community disputes over livestock. But then the testimony takes a turn towards the peculiar. The prosecutor asks the woman, "And would you say the donkey seemed unrepentant?" The woman puffs out her chest. "Oh, absolutely. It looked right at me as it chewed. There was a defiant look in its eye. I tell you, a complete lack of remorse." This is where we wade into the truly strange waters of these proceedings. Witnesses weren't just asked what the animal did, they were often asked to testify about the animal's intent, its character, and its moral state. This anthropomorphism was not just a figure of speech, it was entered into the court record as evidence. A horse might be described as malicious, a bull as habitually angry, or a dog as having a deceitful nature. The court treated these subjective, emotional interpretations as factual testimony. This leads to an absolutely fantastic niche detail from the annals of animal trials: the use of character witnesses for the defense. Just as the prosecution could bring witnesses to attest to the animal's bad character, the defense lawyer could bring witnesses to attest to its good character. You've already seen a version of this in the Savigny piglet case, where the community vouched for the piglets. But in other cases, it was even more explicit. Imagine the donkey's defense lawyer calling his own witness to the stand. An old woman, perhaps the owner's kindly mother, comes forward. The lawyer asks her, "You have known this donkey since it was a foal. What can you tell the court about its general disposition?" The old woman might reply, her voice trembling with sincerity, "He is the gentlest creature you could ever meet. Your Honor, he has a sweet nature. He's always been good with children. I believe he has simply been led astray, or perhaps was driven by a hunger he could not control. It is not in his heart to be a thief." This testimony, describing the donkey's heart and sweet nature, would be taken just as seriously as the testimony about the eaten cabbages. The trial became a battle of competing narratives about the animal's inner life. The historical debate here is about what these testimonies truly represent. Were these people genuinely convinced that they could perceive the moral state of a donkey. One school of thought argues that, in a world where the lines between human and animal were blurred by folklore and theology, people did believe they could read an animal's soul through its eyes. The look in its eye was not a metaphor, it was a window into its moral character. For them, this testimony was as valid as any other observation. However, a more sociological interpretation suggests that this testimony wasn't really about the animal at all. It was about human relationship. When a witness testified about the donkey's defiant nature, they were really expressing their frustration with the donkey's owner. When the old woman testified about the donkey's gentle heart, she was defending her family's honor and standing in the community. The animal in the dock became a silent proxy for the human disputes and social dynamics of the village. The trial was a public forum for neighbors to air their grievances and affirm their alliances, all under the guise of discussing a donkey's personality. This is a key point where scholars still argue whether these trials are a literal legal process about animal guilt, or a highly ritualized form of community conflict resolution. Was the court truly interested in the donkey's remorse? Or was it using the trial to force a settlement between the donkey's owner and his angry neighbors? The answer is probably both. The legal framework was taken seriously, but its ultimate function was to restore social harmony. By allowing everyone to have their say about the facts, the damages, and the donkey's very soul, the court provided a release valve for communal tensions, hopefully leading to a judgment that everyone, if not happy with, could at least accept. The judge in your Swiss courtroom listens patiently to all the testimony. He has heard about the cabbages, the fences, the defiant look, and the gentle heart. He now has to weigh all this evidence, the factual and the emotional, to decide the fate of one very confused-looking donkey. Let's return to the fate of our condemned sow. The verdict has been read, and the execution is set. But there is still one night to pass, a night she will not spend in her owner's sty. Not in a cold, damp cell. You find yourself standing before the local jail, a squat stone building that houses thieves, debtors, and now, a pig. This brings us to a crucial, and often overlooked, aspect of the animal trial process: the formal incarceration of the animal defendant. The moment an animal was accused of a serious crime, especially one resulting in human injury or death, it was often arrested and imprisoned alongside human suspects. This wasn't an informal measure. Like tying a dog to a post, the animal was formally processed into the jail. This is a core historical fact that underscores the bizarre reality of the system. The pig was not just property held as evidence, it was a prisoner awaiting trial. The jailer, a weary man with a large ring of iron keys, unbolts the heavy wooden door to the sow's cell. The conditions are exactly what you'd expect for a medieval jail dock, windowless, with a straw-covered floor of questionable cleanliness. The sow is there, in the corner, a dark shape in the glue. The jailer places a wooden bowl of water and a chunk of coarse bread on the floor, the standard prison rations. He is legally obligated to feed and water his prisoner, and this pig is no exception. This practice of jailing animals created a whole host of strange administrative and financial records, which have become a treasure trove for historians. Town account books from this period contain line items that are, to our eyes, completely surreal. You would find detailed expenses for the upkeep of animal prisoners. A record from one French town in the 15th century shows an entry for expenses of the sow detained in prison: 6 souls. This would be listed alongside payments for road maintenance or the salary of the town guard. The animal's incarceration was a formal, budgeted municipal expense. This leads to a wonderfully absurd niche detail: the problem of prison escapes. What happened if an animal prisoner, say a cat accused of witchcraft, managed to escape its cell? This was treated not as a lost piece of property, but as a fugitive from justice. The jailer could be held liable for the escape, just as if he had allowed a human prisoner to flee. In some documented instances, a formal wanted notice would be issued for the animal, and the community would be alerted to be on the lookout for the furry fugitive. The legal personhood of the animal extended from the courtroom to the prison cell, and even to the status of being on the lam. The historical debate around this practice of animal incarceration is quite revealing. What was the purpose of locking up a pig? The most practical explanation is public safety. An animal that had killed a person was clearly dangerous. Jailing it was the most effective way to prevent it from harming anyone else, before the court could decide its fate. It was a simple, pragmatic quarantine measure. From this perspective, the legal formality was just the bureaucratic language used to describe a common-sense action. However, other historians argue that the act of imprisonment was deeply symbolic and ritualistic. By placing the animal in the same environment as a human criminal, the community was visually and legally reinforcing the idea that the animal was subject to the same laws. It was another step in the process of humanizing the crime. The cell walls collapsed the distinction between beast and man, transforming the pig from a simple farm animal into a defendant. This ritualistic view suggests the imprisonment was less about public safety. A strong pen would have worked just as well, and more about the symbolic integrity of the legal process. It was a performance of the idea that all are equal before the law, taken to its most extreme and literal conclusion. My third perspective, often debated, is that the imprisonment was also a form of punishment in itself. Just as pre-trial detention is a hardship for a human, it was understood to be one for an animal as well, removed from its natural environment, isolated, and fed poor-quality food. Some scholars argue that the community saw this period of incarceration as part of the animal's penance. A foretaste of the justice to come. Was the sow's misery in the cell seen as a form of suffering that contributed to the balancing of the scales of justice? This is a more difficult question to answer, as it delves into the emotional and psychological attitudes of the time, which are rarely stated explicitly in legal records. As you look at the sow in her cell, you realize the prison serves as a kind of legal crucible. The sty is part of the world of nature. The courtroom is the world of law. The prison cell is the liminal space between the two. Inside these four walls, the sow is stripped of her identity as livestock and forcibly given a new one, criminal defendant. Her owner, Jacques Pinchet, is no longer responsible for her. The state is. She is now a ward of the court, a legal entity whose fate is entirely in the hands of the human justice system. The jailer locks the door. The heavy bolt slides home. The sow is left alone in the dark, with her bowl of water and her stale bread. Her night in jail is not just a practical matter of containment. It is the final, formal step in her transformation from a creature of nature into a subject of the law. A transformation that will only be completed at the gallows at dawn. Dawn is breaking. The sky is a cold, pale grey. The executioner has chopped his ropes. But before we proceed to the gallows, let's linger for a moment on the man who holds the final power in this entire process, the magistrate, Jean de Villars. He is not a king or a bishop. He is a local official, a respected elder tasked with maintaining order in his small corner of the world. And in cases like this, the amount of personal discretion he wields is immense. As you observe him on the morning of the execution, reviewing the court documents one last time, you come to understand a fundamental truth of this system. While the trials were wrapped in layers of formal procedure and legal precedent, they often boil down to the judgment call of a single individual. The magistrate, or judge, had enormous leeway in how he interpreted the evidence, how he guided the jury, and ultimately, how he shaped the verdict and sentence. This is the key historical point. Despite the appearance of a rigid system, the outcomes of animal trials were often highly subjective and dependent on the presiding judge's personal beliefs, pragmatism, or even his mood. The law was not a clear, unambiguous code. It was a tangle of local customs, feudal obligations, Roman law fragments, and religious doctrine. A judge could choose which threads to pull on. For instance, in the case of Orsel, Magistrate de Villars could have been swayed by Maitre Béranger's theological argument about demonic possession. Had he been a particularly pious or superstitious man, he might have concluded that this was indeed a matter for the church and thrown the case out of his secular court. Another judge in another town might have done just that. Alternatively, a more modern-thinking or economically minded judge might have seized on the argument of the owner's negligence. He could have steered the jury towards acquitting the pig while imposing a heavy fine on Jacques Pinchet. This would have satisfied the community's need for restitution, punished the responsible human, and spared a valuable piece of livestock. The records show that this happened frequently. The choice between these different legal paths was often a matter of the judge's personal discretion. This is where you find a fascinating and telling niche detail apart. In some documented cases, an animal was found guilty and sentenced to death, but was then given a formal pardon by the presiding authority, be it a judge, a lord, or even a duke. One famous case in the 15th century involved a bull that had killed a man. The bull was convicted and sentenced to hang. However, the Duke of Burgundy intervened and issued a formal pardon. The reason given in the official document was that the bull was young and that the victim had been known to foolishly provoke it. The pardon wasn't an acquittal, it was an act of mercy. It acknowledged the bull's guilt but chose to set aside the punishment. This shows the ultimate power of judicial discretion, the ability to follow the law to its conclusion and then, with the stroke of a pen, set it all aside. The historical debate surrounding this judicial freedom is intense. Was this discretionary power a strength or a weakness of the system? One perspective is that it was a fatal flaw. It made justice arbitrary and unpredictable. An animal's life or death could depend entirely on the whims of one man. It undermined the very idea of the rule of law and made the trials dependent on personality rather than principle. This view sees the system as fundamentally inconsistent and therefore unjust. However, another school of thought argues that this flexibility was the system's greatest strength. It allowed the law to be adaptable to specific local circumstances. A rigid, one-size-fits-all law would have been too brittle to handle the complex social realities of medieval life. The judge's discretion allowed him to tailor the outcome of the trial to achieve the most important goal: restoring social harmony. He could act as a mediator and a social engineer, not just a blind arbiter of rules. If he felt that executing the pig was what the community needed to feel safe and achieve closure, he could steer the trial in that direction. If he felt a fine was a more practical solution that would cause less economic disruption, he could lean that way. In this view, the judge's discretion wasn't a bug, it was the essential feature that allowed the system to function in the real world. Scholars still argue whether these judges were acting as sophisticated legal thinkers or as pragmatic social managers. When a judge pardoned a bull, was he making a nuanced legal argument about diminished responsibility? Or was he simply making a practical decision to save a valuable animal for a favored subject? The documents rarely reveal the judge's inner motivations, leaving historians to debate whether we should see these men as inconsistent legalists or as skilled community leaders. In our story, Magistrate Livier has made his choice. He has listened to all the arguments. He weighed the theological, the procedural, and the practical. He looked at the faces of the jury and the grief of the victim's family. He sensed the fear in the community, and he chose the path of ritual retribution. He has decided that the execution of the sow is the necessary conclusion, the act that will best cauterize the wound on his community. His discretion has led to the gallows. The law, as he has chosen to interpret it, must now take its course. The magistrate's signature on the death warrant is more than just a legal formality. It sends a ripple of consequences through the community, and nowhere is that ripple felt more strongly than with Jacques Pinchet, the sow's owner. As the town prepares for the execution, you see him standing alone near his empty sty, a man stripped of his property, his reputation, and quite possibly his financial stability. The guilty verdict against his pig is, in many ways, a verdict against him as well. This is a crucial, real-world aspect of the animal trials that is sometimes lost in the bizarre details. A guilty verdict was not just a strange quirk of the law, it had significant economic and social consequences, primarily for the animal's owner. This is the central historical point. The trial was a mechanism through which a person could be publicly and financially ruined without ever being formally accused of a crime themselves. First and foremost, there was the direct economic loss. In the 15th century, a healthy, full-grown sow was a major asset for a peasant farmer. It wasn't just a source of future bacon. It was a breeding machine, capable of producing multiple litters of piglets, each of which represented significant future income and food security. The execution of the sow was the destruction of a key piece of capital. It's the equivalent of a modern family having their current savings account confiscated. The loss of the animal itself was a devastating blow. But the costs didn't stop there. This is where a niche, and frankly infuriating, detail of the system comes into play. The owner of the condemned animal was often held liable for the costs of the trial and execution. Think about that for a moment. Jacques Pinchet not only loses his pig, but he is then presented with a bill from the court. This bill would include the cost of the pig's incarceration, the bread and water it ate in jail, the fees for the magistrate and the clerk, the payment for the bailiff, and, the ultimate insult, the fee for the executioner who was about to hang his property. He is being forced to pay for the systematic destruction of his own livelihood. This practice, documented in numerous court records, added a layer of financial punishment on top of the material loss. The historical debate here centers on the motivation behind this practice. Was it simple cost recovery? The town had incurred expenses, and it made sense to force the responsible party to pay them. This is the pragmatic view that it was a matter of municipal accounting, not punitive justice. The owner was seen as the root of the problem, so he should bear the financial burden. However, a more critical perspective argues that this was a powerful tool of social control. By saddling the owner with these costs, the court was sending a powerful message to all other livestock owners in the community: control your animals, or face utter financial ruin. It was a form of collective punishment that incentivized the entire community to be more vigilant. It turned every farmer into a deputy, policing his own animals out of fear of the crippling economic consequences of a trial. This view suggests the financial penalties were less about balancing the books and more about enforcing social norms through economic fear. Beyond the financial ruin, there was the social stigma. In a small, tight-knit village, reputation was everything. The execution of your animal for a capital crime brought immense shame upon your household. Your neighbors would whisper, "Was there something wrong with your farm? Were you a negligent and careless farmer? Or was there something darker at play?" As we've seen, these events were often linked with superstitions about bad luck, curses, or even demonic influence. The execution of the pig could brand Jacques Pinchet's family as unlucky or, worse, as being tainted by evil. This stigma could affect his ability to trade, to get help from his neighbors, and even the marriage prospects of his children. The shame was a real and lasting punishment. Some historians argue that this social aspect was, in fact, the primary function of the trial. They see the trial not as a process to determine the guilt of the animal, but as a ritual to publicly identify and shame the human who had failed in his social duty to control his property. The pig was the scapegoat in the most literal sense, taking the punishment, but the true target of the community's judgment was the owner. The trial was a way to discipline a member of the community without having to go through the more serious process of a human criminal trial. As you watch Jacques Pinchet, you see the full weight of the verdict settle upon him. He hasn't been charged, he hasn't been tried, but he has been punished. He has lost his property. He is facing a crippling debt to the court, and his name is now inextricably linked with a horrific event and a public execution. The sow will hang. But Jacques Pinchet will bear the invisible sentence for the rest of his life. The trial, for all its focus on the animal in the dock, has found its human victim after all. The sun is higher now, casting long shadows from the gallows. The whole town has gathered, but before the final act, let's pull back and appreciate the sheer creativity of the lawyers who fought against this outcome. We've seen Maître Béranger's arguments on the genius of Bartholomew Chesney. They were not alone. Across Europe, for centuries, defense lawyers for animals developed a stunning repertoire of strange, brilliant, and sometimes utterly desperate arguments to save their clients. Let's take a tour of some of the most remarkable and bizarre legal defenses ever presented in a courtroom. These are not just anecdotes, they are testaments to the ingenuity required to operate within such a surreal legal framework. This is the core point. The absurdity of the trials forced the lawyers to become incredibly innovative, pushing the boundaries of legal and theological reasoning. One of the most common and logical defenses was the lack of intent argument. As we saw with Berenger, the lawyer would argue that the animal, being a dumb beast, could not form mens rea, the malicious intent required to commit a crime. This was a solid legal principle, but it often failed in the face of public outrage. So, lawyers had to get more creative. A fantastic example of this creativity comes from the ecclesiastical court. Imagine a case against a swarm of Spanish flies, another type of beetle, accused of damaging crops. The defense lawyer, knowing the lack of intent argument was weak, tried a different tack. He stood before the church court and argued that his clients were, in fact, beneficial to the community. How he pointed out that Spanish flies were the primary ingredient in cantiaceroids, a well-known medicinal powder used by apothecaries as a blistering agent and, more notoriously, as an aphrodisiac. The lawyer argued that by destroying his clients, the court would be depriving the local doctors and apothecaries of a vital medical resource. He was, in essence, making a public health argument on behalf of the beetles. This brings us to an even more obscure and wonderful niche defense, the biblical rights argument. This went beyond Chasney's army of God defense. In a case against a plague of rats, one lawyer took to the floor with an open Bible and pointed to the story of Noah's Ark. He argued that God himself had seen fit to save 2 of every creature, including rats, from the great flood. He commanded Noah to give them sanctuary on the ark. Therefore, the lawyer argued, his clients had a divine, scriptural right to exist and to be given shelter. To persecute them was to go against the very precedent set by God and Noah. He was claiming a kind of animal asylum based on the book of Genesis. The historical debate around these arguments is, as always, about sincerity versus satire. Were these lawyers genuinely trying to find any theological or logical loophole they could? Within a system they believed in, the proponents of this view see them as pious and diligent advocates, using the tools of their trade, scripture and the law in innovative ways. They were like tax lawyers today, finding every possible deduction and exemption for their clients, no matter how obscure. Their creativity was a sign of their commitment to the legal process. The opposing view, of course, is that these arguments are evidence of a deep-seated irony and skepticism. By presenting such far-fetched defenses with a straight face, were these lawyers subtly mocking the entire system? Was the lawyer defending the Spanish flies really concerned about public health? Or was he using the argument to demonstrate the ridiculous lengths one had to go to in these trials when a lawyer claimed biblical sanctuary for rats? Was he making a serious theological point? Or was he engaging in a brilliant piece of legal satire? Using the church's own logic to produce a ridiculous conclusion, this view sees the lawyers as intellectual saboteurs, using their creativity to expose the folly of the proceedings from within. The arguments could also take a procedural turn that was almost postmodern in its complexity. We've seen Chesney's safe passage argument for the rats. There are other examples. In one case, a defense lawyer argued that the summons was invalid because it was addressed to all the caterpillars in a region, but it didn't name each one individually. He argued that just as a lawsuit against all the people in Paris would be legally void for lack of specificity, so too is this one. He was demanding that the court provide a specific list of the names of every single caterpillar defendant. This was a classic tactic of using the system's own obsessive procedural ism to grind it to a halt. These creative defenses, whether sincere or satirical, served a vital purpose. They forced the courts to constantly re-examine and justify their own premises. They introduced doubt, complexity, and nuance into what might otherwise have been simple mob justice wrapped in legal robes. These lawyers, with their wild and wonderful arguments, were the grit in the oyster of the medieval legal system, and their bizarre arguments were the pearls, even when they lost, as mate Berenger did. Their efforts created a rich and fascinating record of legal ingenuity in the face of the ultimate surreal challenge, the execution of the sale proceeds. The community feels a grim sense of closure. The secular court has done its job. But what about the ecclesiastical courts? What happened in the vineyards of Bassenville after the bishop's curse was read and the farmers went home, clutching their holy decree? What happened when, a week later, the snout beetles were still there, munching away on the vines, seemingly unbothered by the threat of eternal damnation? This moment of anticlimax, of failed miracles, is one of the most revealing aspects of the entire phenomenon. You are now witnessing the aftermath of a failed judgment. The curse didn't work. The pests remain. This is not just a practical problem, it's a theological crisis in miniature. The church's most powerful weapon has been deployed and has apparently misfired. How does the system process this failure? As you've seen, the first and most common explanation was to blame the congregation. The parish priest would preach a fire and brimstone sermon about the community's lack of faith. The curse is pure and powerful, he would declare, but it cannot penetrate a shield of sin. Your secret grade, your lazy prayers, your failure to pay your tithes in full, these have rendered the anathema inert. The failure of the curse was thus transformed into a powerful tool for enforcing religious discipline and ensuring the church's coffers were full. This is the mainstream historical understanding of how these failures were rationalized. It was a blame-shifting mechanism that protected the institution's authority. But this wasn't the only explanation. The system had other, more legally sophisticated ways to account for a failed verdict. This is where the defense lawyer, even after losing the case, could sometimes score a posthumous victory. The lawyer might return to the court and file a legal appeal on behalf of the Beatles. This leads to a truly niche and mind-bending legal concept: the appeal against a divine judgment. The lawyer would argue that the curse had failed not because of the people's sin, but because the original verdict was flawed. He might argue that the court had overlooked a crucial piece of evidence, or that there had been a procedural error in the trial. For example, he might claim that the notice of the verdict and curse had not been properly served upon his clients. He would demand that a bailiff be sent out again to read the entire curse to the Beatles one more time, just to make sure they had heard it. In one almost unbelievable case, a lawyer defending a group of pests argued that the curse failed because it was too harsh. He argued that by cursing the animals and consigning them to the devil, the church was effectively giving them to a new master who would have no incentive to control them. He argued for a more lenient sentence, a stern warning, and a renewed order to relocate. He was, in essence, plea-bargaining for his clients after the sentencing, using the failure of the original sentence as his leverage. The historical debate here is about whether these post-verdict maneuvers were signs of the system's resilience or its absurdity. One view is that this shows a legal system capable of self-correction. The ability to appeal, to question a verdict, and to reconsider a sentence are hallmarks of a mature legal process. From this perspective, the system was not a rigid dogma but a flexible institution that could adapt and respond to failure. It shows a surprising degree of intellectual honesty, an unwillingness to let an apparent failure go unexamined. The counter-argument, of course, is that this is simply absurdity piling on top of absurdity. The image of a lawyer filing an appeal for a swarm of insects because their divine curse wasn't working is, to modern eyes, the very definition of a farce. This view contends that the system was a closed logical loop, a self-perpetuating machine that could always find a justification for its own existence, no matter how disconnected from reality it became. The appeals process wasn't about finding justice, it was about adding more layers of legal complexity, further entrenching the roles of the lawyers and judges, then prolonging the entire affair. It was the system admiring its own intricate, if useless, reflection in the mirror. There was also a third, more philosophical explanation for a failed curse. Some theologians and jurists argued that God sometimes chose not to act, even when petitioned correctly by the church. He might allow the plague to continue as a test of faith, to teach the community a lesson in humility and long-suffering. In this interpretation, the failed curse wasn't a failure at all. It was a success in a different way. It was a divine lesson. The goal of the trial wasn't necessarily to get rid of the pests, but to bring the community into a right relationship with God. If that relationship required them to endure the plague, then so be it. This transformed the devastating agricultural event into a spiritual learning opportunity. So in the fields of Bassenville, the farmers are faced with a choice of explanations for their continued beetle problem. Is it their own fault for being too sinful? Is it the court's fault for a legal error that requires a new hearing? Or is it God's will that they should suffer for a while longer? Notice that none of these explanations admit the most obvious one, that a curse has no effect on the biological reality of an insect infestation. The system, in its brilliance, offered a variety of ways to interpret failure, all of which kept the fundamental beliefs intact. The beetles chewed on, oblivious, while the humans debated the complex legal and theological reasons for their continued existence. As we watch the snout beetles continue their feast, a curious question arises. We've seen pigs, bulls, roosters, rats, and all manner of insects in the dock. We've seen terrestrial and flying creatures being prosecuted. But what about the creatures of the sea? You scan the vast library of European animal trial records, and you notice a glaring omission. There are no recorded cases of a dolphin being sued for stealing fish from a net, or a shark being put on trial for attacking a swimmer. Why was the legal system's long arm so conspicuously short when it came to the ocean? The answer reveals a fascinating intersection of law, theology, and the practical limits of human control. The primary reason for this aquatic exemption is rooted in a fundamental legal and philosophical concept: dominion. This is the core historical idea. According to Genesis and the prevailing Christian theology, God gave man dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. This was interpreted in a very practical way. Man's dominion, and therefore his law, extended only as far as his physical control. Humans could control the land. They could fence it, plow it, and build on it. They could domesticate land animals, putting them in pens and barns. A pig or a bull was clearly within the sphere of human control and property. When it transgressed, it was seen as a breakdown of that established order, a rebellion within man's own kingdom. The trial was a way to reassert that dominion. The air was a bit trickier, but birds could be caught, and insects, while numerous, infested human-controlled spaces like fields and granaries. They were invaders in human territory. The ocean, however, was a different world. It was seen as a vast, untamable wilderness, a realm apart from human society. It was God's other kingdom, ruled by its own mysterious laws. Humans could venture out onto its surface. They could harvest its bounty, but they could not control it. They couldn't fence it. They couldn't domesticate its inhabitants in the same way. A fish in the sea did not belong to anyone until it was caught. The ocean represented the boundary of human power, then therefore the boundary of human law. You couldn't prosecute a shark because a shark did not live within your jurisdiction. It lived in its own wild, ungovernable realm. This brings us to a wonderfully strange and niche piece of law that highlights this distinction. While sea creatures weren't put on trial, they were not entirely absent from medieval legal and moral thought. There are numerous medieval bestiaries illustrated manuscripts describing various animals that are filled with moral allegories about sea creatures. The whale, for instance, was often described as being so large that sailors would mistake its back for an island, land on it, and light a fire. The whale, feeling the heat, would then plunge into the depths, drowning the sailors. This was presented not as a crime for which the whale should be tried, but as a metaphor for the devil, who tricks sinners with worldly pleasures before dragging them down to hell. The whale's action wasn't a legal transgression, it was a living parable, a part of a divine symbolic order, not the human legal one. The historical debate on this topic is subtle but important. Was the absence of marine trials a result of this profound theological and philosophical distinction between the tame and the wild? The realm of man and the realm of the sea. This view argues that the medieval mind had a clear conceptual map of the world, and the ocean was firmly in the here be monsters category, a place outside the reach of a bailiff under summons. It was a conscious legal and intellectual choice. Or was it simply a matter of practicality? With a philosophy built up later as a justification, this more pragmatic view argues that the reason you don't put a dolphin on trial is because you can't. How would you arrest it? How would you bring it to the courthouse? How would you imprison it? How would you execute it? The entire legal process, designed for terrestrial creatures, would collapse in the face of these logistical impossibilities. According to this view, the grand theories about dominion and jurisdiction were simply a way of making a virtue out of a necessity. They didn't try dolphins because it was impossible, and they created a philosophical reason for it afterwards. This debate touches on a larger question: does law shape belief, or does belief shape law? Did the belief that the sea was a wild, separate realm led to the legal decision not to prosecute its inhabitants, or did the practical inability to prosecute them lead to the belief that they were legally exempt? This chicken and egg problem is central to understanding the relationship between the practical world and the intellectual frameworks we built to understand it. Interestingly, this exemption didn't always apply to freshwater creatures. There are a few scattered cases of fish like eels or leeches being subject to ecclesiastical curses, usually because they were infesting a specific, human-controlled body of water like a fish pond or a lake. The key difference was control. The pond was part of man's domain in a way the open ocean was not. The line was drawn at the edge of the shore. So while the sow and the snout beetle faced the full force of human justice, the creatures of the deep swam free, protected not by innocence, but by the vast, untamable, and legally impenetrable mystery of the sea. Their wilderness was their shield, a silent, powerful defense that no laid-down lawyer could ever hope to match. Our journey has been confined to the towns and fields of medieval Europe, where this peculiar legal tradition flourished with a unique intensity. But was this phenomenon exclusively European? Did other cultures, in other parts of the world, also feel the need to hold animals before a judge? As we pan out from the French gallows and the Swiss courtrooms, we explore a wider, global perspective, and the answer is both yes and no, revealing how different societies grappled with the same fundamental problem of animal-caused harm. The practice of formal, state-sanctioned animal trials, with lawyers, judges, and documented proceedings, is overwhelmingly a European, and specifically a Christian, phenomenon. The unique blend of Roman legal tradition, Old Testament law, and Catholic theology created the specific intellectual crucible required for this tradition to form. The idea of an animal having a legal personhood sufficient to stand trial is a distinctive feature of this European legal heritage. This is the mainstream historical consensus. The animal trial, as we've witnessed, it is a product of a very specific time, place, and belief system. However, if we broaden our definition from formal trial to ritualized response to animal transgression, we begin to see fascinating parallels and differences in other cultures. For instance, there are records from ancient Greece of a curious legal procedure. In Athenian law, if an object, such as a falling statue or a collapsing wall, caused a person's death, that object would be put on trial. If found guilty, it would be taken to the edge of the state's territory and ceremonial cast out or destroyed. This was a way of ritually cleansing the community of the miasma, the spiritual pollution caused by the unnatural death. While these trials sometimes included animals that had caused death, the focus was on the act itself and the resulting pollution, rather than the moral guilt of the animal or object. It was a civic purification ritual, not quite the same as the personalized justice of the medieval courts. This brings us to a wonderfully niche and fascinating cross-cultural example from Brazil. In the 18th century, long after the tradition was fading in Europe, there is a documented case where the Franciscan friars of the monastery of Santo Antonio in Bahia became fed up with the termites that were eating their way through the monastery's wooden structure and furniture. Instead of simply calling an exterminator, they turned to the old European tradition. They initiated a formal lawsuit against the termites. They filed a complaint in the ecclesiastical court, which appointed a prosecutor for the friars and a defense lawyer for the termites. The termites lawyer argued, much like Chasney, that his clients were God's creatures and had a right to sustenance. He argued that the friars, having taken a vow of poverty, should not be so attached to their worldly possessions. The judge, in a verdict worthy of King Solomon, found a compromise. He acknowledged the termites' right to exist but also the friars' right to their home. He ordered the friars to provide a suitable and separate piece of land for the termites and then ordered the termites, under threat of excommunication, to decamp from the monastery and move into their new, specially designated home. This case is a remarkable echo, a late colonial flowering of a medieval European practice on South American soil. The historical debate here revolves around the question of uniqueness versus universality. Is the European tradition of animal trials a buzz or anomaly, a unique product of a strange intersection of ideas, or is it just one culture's specific expression of a more universal human need to rationalize and respond to the chaos of the natural world through ritual? Those who argue for European uniqueness point to the specific legal machinery, the lawyers, the precedents, the dual court system. They argue that this level of legalistic formalism applied to animals is not found anywhere else. It required the specific intellectual DNA of post-Roman Christian Europe. Conversely, those who argue for a more universal theme point to a wider world of folklore and ritual. Many indigenous cultures have traditions and stories about animal courts or councils where animals judge each other or even judge humans. Many belief systems include rituals for appeasing animal spirits after a hunt or after an animal has caused harm. These scholars argue that while the formal trial is European, the underlying impulse to impose a human moral or social order onto the animal kingdom and to ritually manage the dangerous boundary between the human and non-human worlds is a near-universal aspect of human culture. The European trial is just a version of this impulse that happens to look like a courtroom because European culture is particularly legalistic. This debate asks a fundamental question about history. Do we learn more by studying the unique and specific details that make one culture different, or by searching for the broad, common patterns that connect us all? The animal trial, in this light, can be seen either as a testament to medieval Europe's singular strangeness or as evidence of a shared human desire to find justice and meaning in a world where animals sometimes act in ways that harm us. So while you would be hard-pressed to find a record of a pig being hanged in Ming Dynasty China or a donkey being sued for eating cabbages in the Inca Empire, you would find other, equally fascinating rituals and beliefs designed to manage the same essential conflicts. The European animal trial was not the only way to solve the problem, but it was, without a doubt, the most legally elaborate and, to our eyes, the most profoundly bizarre. The world that created and sustained these bizarre trials could not last forever. As the sun sets on the medieval period and the first glimmers of the Enlightenment appear on the horizon, the intellectual foundations of the animal trial begin to crumble. The journey now takes you out of the courtroom and into the study of a man who, perhaps more than any other, provided the philosophical sledgehammer that would shatter the logic of animal prosecution, the French philosopher. In the mid-17th century, Descartes sat in his study, contemplating the nature of existence. He wasn't thinking about lawsuits against pigs. He was trying to build a new system of knowledge based on reason and certainty. But in doing so, he formulated an idea about animals that would have profound and long-lasting consequences. This is the pivotal historical moment, the rise of Cartesian philosophy and its radical redefinition of what an animal is. Descartes, in his quest for certainty, famously concluded, "I think, therefore I am." For him, the defining characteristic of human existence was the soul, the mind, the ability to reason and possess consciousness. Everything else was just matter in motion. And this, he argued, included animals, according to Descartes. Animals were not thinking, feeling beings. They did not have minds or souls. They were, in his famous and chilling phrase, animal machines, animals machines. He argued that an animal was like a complex clockwork mechanism. It could perform intricate actions. It could react to stimuli. It could even make sounds that resemble cries of pain or joy. But these were all just automatic, mechanical responses, no different from a clock striking the hour or a music box playing a tune. When a dog yelped after being kicked, Descartes argued, it was no different from a bell ringing when its cord was pulled. It was a purely physical reaction, devoid of any inner experience of pain or emotion. This idea was revolutionary and deeply controversial, but it was also incredibly influential. It provided a powerful, scientific framework for understanding the natural world, and in doing so, it completely demolished the entire logical basis for animal trials. If an animal is just a machine, a biological automaton, then the concept of animal guilt becomes meaningless. You can't put a clock on trial for striking at the wrong time. You can't prosecute a machine for malfunctioning. A machine cannot have mens rea or malicious intent. It cannot be possessed by a demon. It cannot be morally culpable. It simply is, or it is broken. This brings us to a rather grim and unsettling niche detail that illustrates the real-world impact of this philosophy. Cartesian thought was used to justify practices that we would now consider horrifically cruel. Scientists and vivisectionists of the period, influenced by Descartes, would perform experiments on live animals without any form of anesthetic. When the animals screamed and struggled, these scientists would dismiss their cries as the meaningless noise of a machine breaking down. They were, in their view, simply studying the mechanics of a biological system. The idea of the animal machine provided a powerful intellectual permission slip to ignore animal suffering. The historical debate here is about the nature of this intellectual shift. Was the decline of animal trials a direct result of the rise of Enlightenment philosophy? A triumph of reason over medieval superstition? This is the traditional narrative. It holds that as people became more educated, scientific, and rational, they simply realized that putting animals on trial was silly and abandoned the practice. Descartes and other thinkers like him provided the intellectual firepower that allowed society to move past its superstitious phase. The animal trial died because it couldn't survive in the bright light of reason. However, more recent historical scholarship has offered a more complex view. Some historians argue that the trials didn't disappear simply because of a new philosophy. They faded away due to a combination of factors. The rise of centralized state power meant that local, feudal courts lost their authority. Legal systems became more standardized and professionalized, pushing out these kinds of folk legal traditions. Changes in agriculture and the relationship between humans and livestock also played a role. The new philosophy of Descartes didn't so much cause the change as it did justify a change that was already happening for other social, political, and economic reasons. Cartesianism became the convenient, modern-sounding excuse for abandoning an old-fashioned custom. This debate gets at a bigger question about historical change. Do ideas doctor history? Or do material conditions doctor history? With ideas coming along later to explain it was the end of animal trials, a victory for a new way of thinking. Or was it a practical evolution that later found its philosophical champion in Descartes? Regardless of the cause, the effect is clear. As the idea of the animal machine took hold, the world that could conceive of a pig as a legal person began to evaporate. The shared universe, where humans and animals both operated under God's law, was replaced by a new, colder one. In this new universe, there was a stark, unbridgeable gulf between humanity, defined by its thinking soul, and the rest of the natural world, reduced to unfeeling matter. You can't put a machine on trial. The intellectual oxygen required for the animal court to breathe had been sucked out of the room. The tradition was now, itself, a dead man walking. The Enlightenment casts long shadows, and in them, the ancient tradition of the animal trial stumbles towards its final, quiet end. The grand theological dramas and intricate legal arguments that once captivated towns and bishoprics are now fading into memory, replaced by a colder, more rational view of the world. Our journey is nearing its conclusion, and we are now seeking the last of its kind. The final documented instances of a practice that had endured for 1,000 years. Finding the very last animal trial is a tricky historical exercise. Records are scattered, and the practice beaten out at different times in different places. But we can trace the final, fading heartbeats, The 18th century saw a dramatic drop-off in formal trials, though the core beliefs sometimes lingered. The mainstream historical knowledge is that by the mid-1700s, the practice was widely seen by educated elites as a ridiculous relic of a superstitious past. One of the last widely cited formal trials took place in France in 1740. A cow was put on trial and found guilty of killing a person, following the ancient ritual. The cow was condemned to death and hanged. However, the tone of the surviving records is different from those of the 15th century. There's a sense of the court going through the motions, following an old and increasingly uncomfortable tradition. The intellectual conviction seems to have drained away, leaving only the husk of the ritual behind. It was a legal ghost, haunting the courtroom one last time. After this, the formal trials of individual large animals for capital crimes seem to vanish from the records in most of Western Europe. The idea of prosecuting a single animal as a murderer had become legally and philosophically untenable. However, the tradition clung on in a different form. In the domain where it had always been most abstract, the ecclesiastical curses against pests. This leads us to a fascinating and little-known candidate for the actual last animal trial. The story takes us far from France, to the unlikely setting of the Mormon heartland in 19th century America. In the 1852s, the early Mormon settlers in the Salt Lake Valley faced a devastating series of plagues of crickets, now often called Mormon crickets, that threatened their first harvests and the very survival of their new community. In response, the Mormon leader Brigham Young and other church elders drew upon the ancient tradition they had inherited from their European Christian roots. They lead their congregations in public prayers, fasting, and solemn religious ceremonies to curse the crickets and command them to depart. They treated the insect plague not just as an ecological problem, but as a test of faith from God, or an assault by Satan on their new Zion. The climax of this story, famously, is the miracle of the gulls, where flocks of seagulls arrived and devoured the crickets, which the settlers saw as a direct answer to their prayers and curses. While it wasn't a formal trial with a defense lawyer for the crickets, this event contained all the core elements of the old ecclesiastical proceedings: a community facing devastation from pests, a belief in a supernatural cause, and a ritualistic, faith-based response led by religious authorities to curse and expel the creatures. It was the spirit of the medieval church court, resurrected on the American frontier. The historical debate here is one of definition. Does the Mormon cricket war count as a continuation of the animal trial tradition? Purists would say no. They argue that without the formal legal structure, the summons, the lawyers, the verdict, it's just a religious ceremony, not a trial. It lacks the specific legalistic character that made the European tradition so unique. To them, the last true trial was something like the 1740 cow case, the last time the formal legal machinery was fully engaged. However, other historians argue for a more thematic connection. They contend that the legalistic framework was always just the elaborate costume. The heart of the tradition was the belief that humans could use ritual and law to confront and control destructive natural forces. In this view, the Mormon event is a clear and direct descendant of the medieval mindset. The legal robes were gone, but the underlying belief system that a plague of insects is a spiritual battle to be fought with faith and curses was identical. They see it as the tradition's last great gasp, a final, dramatic flourish before the modern, scientific worldview took over completely. The official, undisputed end of the practice came through legal reform. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, nations across Europe formally updated their legal codes. These new codes, products of the Enlightenment, explicitly defined a legal person in a way that unequivocally excluded animals. A crime could only be committed by a human being capable of reason and intent. With these new laws, the animal trial was not just obsolete, it was now legally impossible. The door was shut, locked, and the key thrown away. As you stand in the twilight of this long tradition, you see its final, fragmented forms. A perfunctory execution in France, a faith-driven curse in the American desert, a dry legal clause in a new statute book. The great, Surreal theatre of the animal trial did not end with a bang. It simply faded out, becoming a footnote in a logbook, a curious anecdote for historians, a ghost of a world where the law of man and the law of God were believed to extend to every living creature, no matter how small or strange. The gallows stands empty. The bishop's court is silent. The last law book has been rewritten. Our long, strange journey through the world of animal trials is over. We have returned to our own time, a time of science, forensics, and a clear, sharp line drawn between human and animal. As you stand here, at the end of it all, looking back, the final question isn't why did they do it, but what does it tell us about them? And in turn, about ourselves. The entire, centuries-long history of animal trials can be seen as a giant, ornate mirror. The people who conducted these trials weren't looking at the animals, they were looking at their own reflection. They were projecting their deepest anxieties, their most profound beliefs, and their most cherished social structures onto the silent, unconfronted canvas of the animal kingdom. This is the ultimate historical truth of the matter. The trials were never really about the animals. They were always, and only, about the humans. When they prosecuted a pig for murder, they were expressing their terror of sudden, random violence in a world without police forces or emergency services. They were trying to contain the chaos of nature within the predictable, reassuring rituals of the law. The trial was a way of processing communal trauma, of taking a horrific, meaningless event and giving it a name, a cause, and a resolution. It restored a sense of human agency and order in a world that often seemed to have none. When they took a swarm of beetles to court, they were grappling with their absolute dependence on the natural world. They were expressing their fear of starvation, of ecological disaster, of forces so vast and numerous that they felt utterly helpless. The ecclesiastical trial was a way of fighting back with the only weapons they had: faith, ritual, and the conviction that a just God would ultimately protect his faithful. It was a structured, communal response to overwhelming anxiety. This brings us to one final, poignant, niche detail. In all the records, there is a recurring theme of the community trying to understand the motive of the animal. They couldn't accept that a pig would kill a child for no reason, or that weevils would destroy a harvest out of simple biological impulse. They needed a story. So they invented motives they could understand: demonic possession, divine retribution, malice, greed. These are human motives. They were forcing the animal's actions into a human moral framework because it was the only way they could make sense of them. The alternative, that the universe is indifferent and that tragedy can be random and meaningless, was simply too terrifying to contemplate. The historical debate at this summative stage becomes a philosophical one. Does the history of animal trials show us a world of profound, alien superstition? A dark age of irrationality that we have thankfully outgrown. This is the progress narrative. The idea that we have advanced beyond such primitive beliefs. We have science, biology, and psychology. We understand animal behavior. We would never put a pig on trial. This view sees the story as a measure of how far we've come. However, a more introspective and critical view asks if we've truly changed that much. We no longer put animals on trial. But do we still project our human anxieties and narratives onto them? We talk about criminal dog breeds. We get morally outraged at a cat that harms a bird, attributing human cruelty to a natural predator. In high-profile cases of an animal harming a human, we often see public calls for the animal's destruction that feel less about public safety and more about a thirst for retribution, a need for a simple, satisfying, violent conclusion. We still sometimes talk about nature as if it has a will, a vengeance against humanity for climate change. This more challenging perspective argues that while the legal framework is gone, the underlying psychological impulse to moralize the natural world and to seek simple, satisfying narratives for complex events is still very much a part of the human condition. The animal trial is not just a historical curiosity, it's a case study in how human societies cope with fear and chaos. It's an extreme example of a timeless human tendency. As you step away from this long history, The story of the pig, the rooster, and the beetles becomes more than just a buzz or anecdote. It becomes a parable. It's a story about a world struggling to find order in chaos, justice in tragedy, and meaning in a universe that often offers none. They used the tools they had: law, religion, and ritual. Their solution looks absurd to us now, but the fears they were trying to quell are fears we still understand. The mirror they held up might be ancient and distorted, but if we look closely enough, we can still, just faintly, see our own reflection. And so, the courtroom of history finally empties, the echoes of the bailiff's cry fading into the long, quiet corridors of time. The last candle has sputtered out. The heavy law books are closed, gathering the dust of centuries on a forgotten shelf. The story is over. Let the details of the trials, the strange arguments of the lawyers, the grim finality of the gallows, let them all begin to soften now, blurring at the edges, like ink bleeding into old parchment. Feel the weight of the story begin to lift, floating away like a dandelion seed on a slow, evening breeze. You can leave the noise and the fear of that medieval world behind. The scent of damp stone undole gives way to the familiar, gentle scent of your own room. The flickering candlelight is replaced by the soft, steady darkness behind your closed eyes. There are no more verdicts to be rendered, no more souls to be judged. There's only the quiet rhythm of your own breathing, a steady, peaceful anchor in the calm sea of the present moment. The journey is done. You are safe. You are home. The world of the past can now melt completely into the world of dreams, where perhaps a very confused pig is finally acquitted and wanders off into a field of endless, delicious truffles. The end of the article. Good night.